welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And a couple of other things, if we could, just one more round of applause, please, for Eileen Becker for putting this together. And Peninsula Radio Group, and the most conservative stations in the world. I think she's got that right, and she will find you if you don't vote. So I'll give you the rundown of what we're going to do, and then I'll get the order out there in front of you. So each candidate will have 3 minutes to make an introduction and make an opening statement, and then from there we'll go through a rotation of questions. We hope to get through about 10 to 12 questions tonight, and we're starting in order of the candidate that responded first with the request for the debate, and this should merely happenstance, and it just seemed to be better than alphabetical because it's not my best subject in school, but neither is mine. So we'll start with Mr. Miller, move on to Lieutenant Governor Treadwell, and then Mr. Sullivan. So that will open the program this evening, and then from there we'll go, like I said, through the questions beginning as such. We'll follow up that way. You'll know when you've reached the end of your minute when you hear, thank you. Let's try that one more time. You'll know you've reached the end of your minute when you hear, beautiful, theater of the mind right here. That's genius. And so that just means you've got about maybe 15 seconds to wrap it up, and we're not going to be obnoxious about how we cut you off, but at some point there will be a hook, and we'll come out on stage and grab you. So, and then what we'll do towards the end of our 10 to 12 questions is we'll allow for each candidate to ask the other candidates, if they're choosing, 2 questions. And so as far as housekeeping on follow-up, if you feel that you need to follow up with something that was said by another candidate, please indicate so, and we'll allow for 1-minute follow-ups. And or you can refer to it as a rebuttal, however. But we are in the cosmic hamlet by the sea, so seems like follow-up seemed like a nice way to put that. So closing statements by each candidate, then 3 minutes additional, and we'll just sort of rotate through maybe from when we last left off. That's the kind of thing that I'll make those decisions on the fly. It's literally the only power I have here this evening, so I'll exercise and wield it accordingly. And then the only other thing I guess I would say is that there's been one, all campaigns have agreed that there'll be one videographer this evening, and the tapes will be made available to each of the campaigns and to Peninsula Radio Group. And we'd ask that there be no other video ongoing during the debate this evening. If you'd respect that, please. That's on behalf of Land's End Resort. They will come and fund you and see you. So I guess without further ado, I can't think of anything I've missed. I think we've got all housekeeping out of the way. Again, one more round of applause for these gentlemen for coming all the way to Homer. And so, Mr. Miller, since you were the first to acquiesce to our little evening here, we give you 3 minutes to begin now.
Well, good evening, and thanks for coming out tonight. It doesn't take much to come down here when you've got nice weather like this and still have pretty good fishing. I always enjoy coming down to Homer and enjoying what this area of the state has to offer. I want to also give a special thanks to Eileen Becker. This is kind of like herding cats when you put 3 candidates together. And I know you went through a lot with all the candidates, and as I heard, even some politicos out of DC, so thank you, Eileen. And thank all the volunteers that also put this together. There are a lot of people from all the campaigns that put a lot of sweat equity into this. My campaign's made up primarily of volunteers. I'm sure there are many volunteers on the other campaigns too, and we thank you for that effort. You know, many people have asked me, Joe, why are you doing this again? After a multi-million-dollar smear campaign in 2010, you've got a family, why are you doing this yet again? And I think all of us have probably a thought or two as to why. For me and my family, it's pretty clear. I mean, this country right now, we just heard this last quarter, the economy shrank at 2.9%. You know, some estimates, if you actually calculate the CPI the way it should be, say it's actually closer to 5 or 10% that it shrank this last quarter. And that's substantial. There are many other things that are staring us in the face. We'll talk a little bit about the deficit. 17.5 trillion in absolute debt. The future unfunded liabilities have now more than doubled since that election back in 2010. $200 trillion, it's a number that simply cannot be paid. We all know it. I mean, anybody that has common sense looking at those numbers understands that the federal government cannot continue in the direction it's going. And we all have to scratch our heads and ask ourselves, why are we here right now? Why is this happening? I mean, for 30 of the last 34 years, Republicans have controlled the House, the Senate, and or the presidency. You know, Republicans, supposedly the party of small government. And yet government has expanded each and every year. It's continued to expand against our liberties. You know, power is a zero-sum game. If the government takes, your choices are limited. We can see that in Obamacare, for example, a democratic program. But yet again, when we talk about compromise in the Congress, we've got to have men and women of character that are going to stand up to this. And that's why we're here. I've had a little bit of a change, though, over the last several years. I'm now a grandparent. As of December of 2010, and many of you can identify with this, my daughter of 2013, my daughter, who's a missionary down in Mexico, had our first grandchild. And that puts a whole new perspective on things. I have 8 children, and we're always thinking about that next generation, but even a generation beyond that. What kind of world are we going to leave them with? I mean, very often what we see in decision making is the instant gratification, the heat of the moment. Who's going to put pressure here? Who's going to put pressure there? This is not the time for weak-kneed politicians. It cannot be more of the same. You have to elect somebody that has a demonstrated record of standing up to compromise, a demonstrated record of fighting against the establishment, somebody who's not just going to give you platitudes and rhetoric, but somebody who's actually going to fight for you and your purposes and your children and your children's future. We need hope and opportunity. I ask for your vote August 19th. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joe. Mead, you would have 3 minutes to open up. Thank you.
Good evening. Eileen Becker, thank you. Chris Story, thank you. John Faulkner, thank you. And I guess the eyes of the bloggers are upon us, if not all of Alaska. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Homer's very special in our family. I fell in love with my wife, Carol, across the bay. Tim, who's not here tonight, was baptized at Chinaput. Natalie and Will are here. We had gathered at Tutka Bay to mourn baby Jack, who died of SIDS before he could be baptized. Natalie caught her first Dolly Varden trout here, and we kid her today that she had no idea what kind of danger I was in when I fell off the skiff and had to be rescued. She was yelling, "Save the fish, save the fish," and I was yelling, "Save your daddy." Well, Natalie, I'm glad you saved your daddy. Here in public service, I've worked with your legislators, and Paul, it's nice to see you tonight, to get natural gas to Homer after there were 2 governors' vetoes. We helped bring rigs, jobs, and new energy to Cook Inlet. I was part of Wally Hickle's team that purchased Kachemak Bay State Park. And after Exxon Valdez, I helped found the Regional Citizens Advisory Councils, and I've pushed for strong local science as your chair of the Arctic Research Commission and as your lieutenant governor. Now, you can elect a senator this year who has served and worked for 40 years in Alaska to launch real businesses, to build our exports, and make our state and country stronger. I believe it is time for conservatives to take back the Senate. And I'm a conservative with a record of real accomplishment in helping to protect life and liberty. And I've actually won elections, and I'm honored to have been serving as your lieutenant governor. Our federal government spends too much. It borrows too much. It taxes too much. It meddles too much. And it snoops too much. It forgets the basic role of government, read it in the Declaration, is to protect our rights, including that of the unborn, not to take them away. And the service side of our government, and I want a Coast Guard, I want clean streets, but the service side of our government asserts itself as our master, and that has to change. Our statehood founders were my mentors, including Bill Egan, Wally Hickle, Ted Stevens, and Jay Hammond, and today they would demand that land and power come back to the states. Mark Beckage has not joined that crusade, but as I have helped lead it here in Alaska, I will in Washington, D.C. Let's send a senator to Washington with a crowbar, not a gunny sack. A pile of federal money will not secure our future. We need to pry loose our liberties and our land so we can make our future. Washington is stuck on stupid, and your vote will send a message to those bureaucrats, Democrats, and yes, establishment Republicans who don't fight for real change either. We're coming to take our country back. Thank you.
Dan, you've got 3 minutes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Eileen, thank you for all that you've done for this tonight, and also the mention of your son. You know, what a great honor to have a son like that serving our country. Great to be back. I was just here a couple weeks ago campaigning, and I stand before you as a candidate, but also, in my view, a very blessed man. I'm a blessed man. My wife Julie and I will be celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary. We're married in Fairbanks beginning of August, so we're going to be celebrating that very soon. We're blessed with 3 teenage daughters. Keeps us rather busy in the Sullivan household right now. But we're also blessed because, like all of you, we live in the greatest state, in the greatest country in the world. And you know, on a day like today, heaven's got to look a little bit like Homer because it's so beautiful, beautiful here. And like my fellow Republicans, I'm an American by birth and an Alaskan by choice. I have a deep love for our state, our great state, and our country, and I've spent most of my career in the service of both, as your Attorney General, as your DNR Commissioner, as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, and as a Marine Corps Infantry and Reconnaissance Officer still serving in the reserves. In fact, the only time I've left the state after getting out of the Marine Corps my first time 17 years ago was to serve my country after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So why am I running? Why am I up here? I believe that the country that all of us love, that we love, has fundamentally been going in the wrong direction. Trillions of dollars of debt on our kids' backs, resource development that's delayed or shut down, veterans who aren't being taken care of, the rule of law that's being shredded. And I want my kids to have a brighter future than the one we've inherited, and that's not happening because of this agenda that I just talked about, the Harry Reid, Barack Obama, Mark Begich agenda. The most important thing we can do in 2014 is to roll back that agenda. And the way we need to start doing it is to make sure that Mark Begich is a one-term senator. My campaign has been focused on not giving him a pass on his failed record. We are the one campaign here that has been taking the fight to Mark Begich. We have also been very focused on the primary. And what we need to talk about tonight is who does have the record among Republicans of getting real results, not just talk, of fighting the federal government's overreach, in the arena battling them, resources and organization to beat Mark Begich in the fall and start rolling back this Obama, Harry Reid, Mark Begich agenda. And I believe I am that candidate. And I believe not only that I am that candidate, but Mark Begich and his liberal allies would also agree, to the tune of $3 million that they spent attacking me over the last 3 months. But Alaskans are not tricked by this. Our campaign, our grassroots, our organization continues to grow stronger, and I would be honored by your support in your vote in the August primary. Thank you very much for being here. I look forward to a healthy, excited forum. Thank you.
I'm being passed important communique, Paul Revere. Would you please silence your cell phones at this time if you've got one that is not silenced? Thank you very much. So thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your time once again, and also your opening statements. And so, Mr. Miller, I opened with Joe, Meade, and Dan, and we'll now move to Mr. Miller, Mr. Treadwell, and Mr. Sullivan, just to keep things on the up and up. But it's nice to meet you as human beings, so thank you very much for that. All right, we'll move into resource development. So with Alaska being so richly blessed, and I think everybody here recognizes and acknowledges that, what as senator will you do to ensure that Alaskans benefit from resource development? And if we could go specific and drill down into, pun intended, what specifically in your first 100 days would you do regarding ANWR, Mr. Miller?
Well, first I want to say that the reason that we're at where we're at today is because we've not focused political energies on natural resources in this state like they should be. Instead, we've looked toward the easy money. And we as a state know that that easy money is going away. What we have to do is make sure that we join the effort that's going on right now across the United States to stand up to the federal government. We saw that with the Bundy Ranch confrontation. We saw that also to a lesser extent at the government shutdown at the end of last year, where people stood up and said, why in the world is the Obama administration retaliating politically against people or against this country just simply because it could and because it wanted to take its pound of flesh? The federal government in a position of land ownership is the #1 way to change things. There's a senator right now in Washington, D.C., Ted Cruz, who sponsored the American Renaissance Energy Act. That's something that would allow us as a state to actually go out and lease federal land and put it into production. ANWR obviously is one of the things that we could use also our political pressure on. Instead of going and trying to focus on easy appropriations, instead what we have to do as a state, as a delegation from the state, is understand that when we have 17.5 trillion in debt, when we have 200 trillion in future unfunded liabilities, the money that's come easy to us, it's got a limited lifespan. We already see that. We've gone from 12 billion, I think, at the peak, now down to 5 billion in federal funding. And yet, why is the fact that we aren't using the seniority that we have to pry open the resource base? I think that there are many things that can be done as well on the general resource basis. When we look at North Dakota, for example, North Dakota right now is nearing a 2% unemployment rate. It's extraordinary. Why is that? The independents have been harnessed in order to produce the hydrocarbons in that state that are just a fraction of our own. And think about that. North Dakota is drawing out oil workers from this state. I have friends right now out of Fairbanks that have left Fairbanks, left the North Slope, and they're working down in the lower 48. It doesn't make a lot of sense when we as a state are sitting on more resources than any other state in the nation. We look at what's happened here in the Cook Inlet, largely a consequence of the independence of their production. That is the future of the state, and it's one that we cannot, I don't think, put in second tier. It's got to be a priority, and with that we can create jobs for our kids and grandkids. But it takes political will, and that has to be the focus of our efforts.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miller. Well, Mr. Treadwell, as Senator, what would you do to ensure Alaskans can benefit from resource development, and if you'd speak specifically to ANWR in your first 100 days?
100 days, Chris, that was your question. The first 100 days, the first vote that Mark Begich took was for Harry Reid as majority leader. I will vote for a Republican majority leader, and I want to see conservatives take control of the Senate, number one. Number two, if we get enough Republicans in there, Lisa Murkowski will be chair of the Senate Energy Committee. I will work with her to report an ANWR bill to the floor, but that's not all. We have a problem with a president right now who threatened in his State of the Union message last year to use his pen to set aside what he called pristine areas of the public lands in the state. I want to take away his pen, and I think we have to look at the Antiquities Act and very quickly make sure the president does not have that power to set aside ANWR into wilderness or other large areas of our state. There is a bill that is sponsored by Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, who's been very supportive of my campaign, that would take all the energy rights on federal land and give them to the states. I support that bill and other bold measures to move state land or move federal land into the hands of the states. It is already, there's one bill that's already passed the House with Forest Service land in Oregon and California, and there are other bills that should pass the House, pass the Senate, and move on. We have a senator who came into office, gave his 60th vote for Obamacare. He had actually campaigned on opening ANWR. He had had a strategy to get into ANWR from the edges, and he didn't do it. He gave away his vote. I would not have voted for Obamacare, obviously, but this is something that's incredibly important for Alaskans, and my colleagues will know it. Finally and foremost, I'll just say the commissioner and I have worked together with our governor to support our governor's initiatives to try to help open ANWR already. We leased land on the edges of ANWR. We settled Point Thompson, and we're bringing the infrastructure right to the boundaries of ANWR. And we are working to use the provisions in ANILCA, and there are more provisions in ANILCA yet that could get us in there for at least basic exploration.
All right, thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, as Senator, what would you do to ensure Alaskans are benefiting from resource development, and again, specifically, your first 100 days regarding ANWR?
Well, Chris, thanks. Is a great question. And again, one of the things that I'm going to emphasize is the importance of action. Not talking, but taking action. And you know, I think in Alaska we're starting to see a turning of we're turning the corner in terms of resource development. I think in a positive way, through policies of less government, more freedom. You know, I've been proud to have led the efforts over the last several years with Governor Parnell on tax reform, on regulatory and permitting reform, on keeping the federal government out of Alaska, and on going and pitching this great state and what we have in terms of resources. So whether it's the Cook Inlet Energy Renaissance and the strategy we put together, SB 21, getting that over the goal line, we're starting to see the decline turning around on the North Slope. Meade mentioned Point Thompson. I was proud to have been the lead on settling that and then jump-starting our gas line progress. It is opportunity and optimism through less government, more economic freedom. And yes, ANWR. You know, Mark Bagich has failed miserably on that. What we did, the state took action. I worked with my colleagues at DNR. We put together a 200-page plan on ANWR development because under ANILCA it says we can do that. And we put it forward, in part because we heard the Secretary of Interior was getting ready to designate ANWR a wilderness area. Mark Bagich was sleeping, of course. We went, introduced this to Congress. We did a big press conference. We presented it to the administration, and we did it in part to throw sand in the gears of their potential wilderness designation on ANWR. And then we presented and said, under ANILCA, you have to accept this. Of course, the Obama administration rejected it, so we sued them. And I think, you know, last time in our debate, Meade, you referred to that 200-page plan as a gimmick. We worked on that for over a year. That's no gimmick. That is a serious plan. And as your U.S. Senator, I would certainly focus on getting that plan moved forward through legislation, 200 pages on exploration under ANILCA, and I would focus on access. But with Mark Bagich in the Senate and Harry Reid as majority leader, we will never open ANWR, and that's one of the reasons he has to go.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Everybody's favorite subject next, taxation. We'll start with you, Mr. Treadwell, at this point. What legislation would you author or sign onto that may already be in existence that would simplify the tax code, i.e. a flat tax, or would you offer some other solution to our very complicated tax code?
Chris, I would like to see the IRS go on. I would like to see a fair tax implemented. I would like to see the Constitution changed that ultimately offered an income tax. I don't think we need an income tax. Our country lasted for 137 years without it. And it's about time that all Americans had some role in paying for the cost of our government. And it's about time that we had the right kind of incentive system to build economic growth in this country. The IRS is a fraudulent agency, in my opinion. I believe it needs to be investigated. I believe there's people whose heads need to roll. And frankly, I'd like to see it be done. But that's not the only thing we have to do. I'd also say that I would push for a constitutional amendment on a balanced budget. And if we have any more votes on extending a debt limit, I will not vote for a debt limit unless we have a vote on a balanced budget amendment.
All right, Mr. Treadwell, thank you very much. Mr. Miller, same question. Essentially, if there's already legislation in the works, what would you sign on to? What would you author? And or would you introduce a flat tax or some other solution to what is a very complicated tax code, Mr. Miller?
I've been a long-time advocate of the fair tax since 2010. Meade, I'm glad to hear that you're now subscribing to that. The fair tax is something that abolishes the IRS. It actually requires a constitutional amendment, so it's not easily done, but there are a number that are co-sponsoring that in the House right now. The fair tax, the beauty of it is it would create an economic boom to this country like none other. We have $13 trillion right now offshore. That would come flooding back into a system that would have no taxation at all, except for the flat or the fair tax. It's a consumption tax. All other taxes go. So that means that you work, you get a paycheck back. Everything that you get in that paycheck, everything that you get paid, there's no deduction for any type of tax. In addition to that, it would also get rid of all that compliance cost. You know, by some estimates, there's something like, I don't know, $1 trillion and 6 billion hours right now in compliance costs associated with the IRS. Of course, the IRS is also responsible for a lot of abuses. We've all heard about that, right? And I still, to this day, I scratch my head as to how the IRS could be found out to be targeting these various groups across the country, conservative groups, people like Tea Party groups. Folks, they're really they're a little bit of an irritation to both parties, right? And the reason why is because we really don't have people standing up to the IRS in the Congress on either side of the aisle. Instead, you've got leadership in the Republican Party that's unwilling to hold the IRS to account because it's actually targeting the folk that are actually giving the Republican Party a hard time as well. The IRS should not be used as it's being used. The fair tax would get rid of it. And not only that, it would allow us as a country to do things like never before. Let me just give you this as an image of what taxation does to us today. At every stage of production, there's a tax. So when you buy a loaf of bread, it has taxes from the grain that's planted, from the fuel tax for transportation, to the mill that grinds the wheat, to the transport to the store. And when you add in all that taxation, you end up with a substantial part of the cost of bread paying taxes. The fair tax gets rid of it all. And it actually reduces your taxes and creates an economic engine that would make this economy in the United States #1 worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Sullivan, we turn to you. Taxation, it's complicated. Is there something out there that you'd sign on to our author and that would provide a solution to what's a very complicated code?
So thanks, Chris. So first of all, I would oppose any new taxes, right? Raising taxes. I think that's something that candidates would all agree on, but I'm going to make that statement very clear. Secondly, I think we need to work dramatically to simplify our tax code, closing the thousands of loopholes that are in there. But I'm going to take a bit of a different approach with regard to what we can do most immediately. And I think what we can do most immediately is focus on the overregulation of our economy. What a lot of people forget is that when our federal government overregulates every aspect of our lives, and they do it, it's the #1 issue I'm hearing on the campaign trail, everywhere, that there are thousands of hidden taxes to businesses that relate to all these burdensome regulations. And they're regulating everything. So to me, one of the most effective way to get a hold of a mess in terms of taxes is to freeze regulations. Freeze regulations from the federal government. And that can be done. If we get a Republican Senate, the House has already passed what's called the REINS Act, which makes federal agencies have to come back and report any regulation that they have issued to make sure that Congress agrees that that fit with statutory requirements of the regulation. To me, that is a huge and instantaneous way in which we can get a hold of the thousands of taxes that hit us on a daily basis that are hidden. And I'll give you one example on that. When I was your Attorney General, after Obamacare was passed, I sat down with a team of lawyers and we actually went through it and read it. I'm not going to say I read every word of it, but I guarantee I read more than Mark Begich, Barack Obama, and Nancy Pelosi, who famously said, we need to pass it to figure out what's in it. But that document has dozens of tax increases, Obamacare. And the regulations are even more burdensome in terms of taxes. To me, the best way to simplify taxes most immediately is to freeze the huge regulatory burden that we as Alaskans have, and that's what I would focus on.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. We turn next to Mr. Miller and a subject that is not far from anyone's mind here tonight, and that's $17 trillion in debt and climbing. It's federal debt. It's climbing every day. How would you take this into consideration when responding to the needs of your Alaskan constituents? When it comes to Alaska-specific projects, how likely would you be to use a red pen, and can you provide an example?
Well, you remember that a few years ago I said it doesn't matter who you elect, federal funding to this state will go down. And we've seen that dramatically. I also said it didn't matter who you elect, we're going to lose earmarks. That has also happened. We're at a point now where it's not a question as to where we're going to spend, it's a question as to where we cut. And I've already mentioned the numbers. You've heard them before, I'm not going to mention them again, except to say that every year we're spending now anywhere from $400 to $500 billion in interest, and that number is continuing to go up. The era of basically the gunny sack is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. Both Senator Begich and Senator Murkowski sit on appropriations, and it's not like it used to be. The promises can't be kept that have been made to the specialized interests. What we have to do as a state, we have to focus in on those areas that are exceptionally important to the country or are within the enumerated powers of the federal government. Article 1, Section 8, what does it say? 18 enumerated powers to the federal government. One of those, of course, is the military. We sit in a very important geostrategic location, a critical location. We have a Chinese government that's pushing back at all edges, whether it be in our airspace, where it now is requiring us to get forenotice before we fly, in some of their airspace, where it's the South China Sea, where they're threatening the Philippines' territorial integrity, they're threatening Vietnam and other countries. The fact is they're pushing hard. The Russians, as we saw in Crimea, are also pushing. And we sit at a center point. General Mitchell said, and this has been a number of years ago, that Alaska sits on probably the most strategic position geographically of any place in the world. And because of that, the military is an answer where we can continue to spend, and justifiably so, and we need to, for the interest of this country, and to push back against those that don't appreciate freedom, don't appreciate the foundational values that our country was founded on. My son right now is a second-year cadet at West Point, preparing to serve his nation. He doesn't want to sit in a position where, because of the debt, which Admiral Mullins, by the way, called the #1 threat to our national security, that he could end up sacrificing his life. We owe it to our men and women in uniform, including Eileen, your son that's given so much, to ensure that they have what it takes to defend our nation and to push back against those foreign forces that would do us harm.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Treadwell, next to you, 17 trillion and climbing. When it comes to Alaska-specific projects and meeting the needs and wants of your Alaskan constituents, how likely would you be to use the red pen, and can you provide an example?
Chris, very likely, and I didn't hear very much about specifics with Alaska, but from Joe, but let me just say this. I'm Lieutenant Governor in administration, where the governor has put out very clear signal to all the agencies, we are not to go get federal earmarks, and the world has not ended. Governor Palin did pretty much the same thing, all right? And when I make my statement about a gunny sack full of money, I really am serious about a crowbar. Now, first and foremost, you have federal agencies in this state, all of whom have developed some form of paramilitary organization for law enforcement, with crazy examples of EPA descending upon miners and chicken, where the state has the authority delegated already from the EPA to enforce that law. That's just one example. Where you have a trooper in Wrangell, Forest Service law enforcement officer, who goes and knocks on the door of a daycare provider and saying, you came and took your kids to a picnic table on a day like this to look at the water and you didn't have a franchise permit. That's nuts. We don't need half the government that we have here in Alaska. I want to see land transferred to the state, okay? So the Forest Service doesn't need to have to spend so much money to not build roads. We will have a we will get rid of the roadless rule, and we will see things happen in Southeast Alaska again in terms of timber development that's sustainable, sustainable energy, sustainable mining. All right, we get rid of those rules. The revenue will come. Likewise, federal plans should not ever take effect in the state without the permission of the state. When the president with his pen cut the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska in half in 2012, that in my mind was unauthorized use of his power, and it's the kind of effort where the federal government is spending its money in the wrong place in the wrong direction and not putting land into production. Ask anybody around this country, what should we be doing with our federal lands? Environment and development. The federal government has failed at development, and that's why we have to bring the land home.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, 17 trillion in debt. All right, you got to provide for your Alaskan constituents. When it comes to specific projects, how likely would you be to use the red pen, and can you provide an example?
So, Chris, 17 trillion in debt is literally one of the reasons why I'm standing here running for the U.S. Senate. I think it is one of the biggest issues facing our country, facing my children, me and Joe's kids, all of your children, grandchildren. It is a moral issue that we are leaving this gigantic burden on our kids' backs. No generation in America has done that. And that's happening. And it's horrendous. And we need to change it. And a lot of people talk about different ways to do it. The critical way, in my view, the only way to realistically get rid of that debt is to do what this Obama administration and Harry Reid and Mark Begich have been unable to do, and that is grow our economy. Last quarter, as Joe mentioned, we shrunk almost by 3%. We've had the weakest recovery in American history from a major recession. And it's not a mystery why. Because we're regulating every aspect of this economy. I saw a statistic recently that said if we could grow back to American levels of growth, 4% GDP, 4.5% GDP growth, for 10 years without increasing spending, we could get rid of our entire debt within 8 to 10 years. It's all about growth. We also need entitlement reform, and we also need to cut spending. From my perspective, particularly engaging with hundreds and thousands of Alaskans over the last several months campaigning, to me it's very clear. Alaskans would want less regulation, less red tape, more access to sustainable economic opportunities than they would for an additional government program. I think almost anyone would take that deal. So to me, it's a simple deal. We need to cut government spending for sure. I think we should cut in 2009, the EPA's budget was increased by 40% by this president. And I think 40% of it ended up here. What we need to do is take the deal of less government, more freedom, less red tape, more access to federal land, and we can reduce spending up here because we'll have a sustainable economic future that will lift the middle class. That's what I'm going to be focused on, economic growth.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. All right, Mr. Treadwell, we'll start with you on our next question, and it reads as follows. Climate change has scientists and compelling data on both sides. The debate may rage on for decades to come. Specifically, what is the U.S. doing right, and where are we going wrong with respect to climate change? Mr. Treadwell.
Right now, we have a president who is trying to lead us into a global agreement that is going to raise your energy prices, is going to affect your lifestyle, and is not going to change the weather. And anybody who believes that by raising your taxes you could change the weather, I've got a bridge to sell you. Now, I can tell you my record on climate change is strong and it's real. I was chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. I helped make sure that we had the appropriate science. When the liberals attacked me for actually daring to bring somebody who had studied the planetary variations, the solar variations, I said, bring it on. And there should be good science and a good scientific debate. Here in Alaska, we should be working to adapt. And we have to adapt when the Arctic Ocean is opening up, when new shipping is coming through, and we don't have the icebreakers, and we don't have the shoreline protections that we need. So we have to be adapting. So that's a good thing, and we're working on that. As far as national policy is concerned, I believe in clean energy policy. I believe in what people in Homer are thinking about here in terms of tidal power. I love the expansion of Bradley Lake. In our administration, we put forward $3 billion for energy development in the 4 years I've been there to help get Alaskans on long-term depreciating cost energy that has appropriate, that is cleaner than what we've got, and that's the way we should be going.
All right, Mr. Treadwell, thank you. And Mr. Sullivan, regarding climate change, scientists, both sides, compelling data. Debate may rage on for a long time to come. Specifically, what is the United States doing correct, and where are we going wrong with respect to
Well, I think, Chris, you mentioned the debate is still raging, right? I think the jury's still out. There's no full consensus in the scientific community. Obviously, with 7 billion people on the planet, there's going to be some impact. But what I think we need to focus on, again, goes back to the issue of growth. And right now, what we're clearly doing wrong is we have an administration that is not focused on taking advantage of huge opportunities in the energy sector. Instead, you have EPA rules that just came out that are essentially trying to crush the coal industry, kill it, whether in Alaska or throughout the rest of the country. You know, one of the things when I was your Attorney General that I was proud of, I took the EPA to court on saying you do not have the legislative authority to issue regs under the Clean Air Act. And that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Mike Garrity finished that up for us strong. A month ago, that decision came out. We won big. We need to challenge these regs. We cannot allow, people call it a war on coal. It's a war on the middle class. It's a war on affordable energy. And we are hurting ourselves as a country when we have enormous opportunities with regard to energy. In the Bush administration, I worked on increasing energy overseas. Mostly hydrocarbons, gas, oil. But to me, one of the things that's happening that's amazing in this country is this giant energy renaissance that's going on throughout the country. You know, now we're the biggest producer of natural gas in the world, bigger than Russia. We're the biggest producer of oil in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia. Alaska needs to be leading those efforts. But that provides huge opportunities, and it provides huge opportunities even in the area of greenhouse gas emissions. With this boom in natural gas, we've seen dramatic decreases. So to me, we need all of the above energy. We do not need to be harming our economy. We do not need to be taxing carbon. And if there's any kind of global approach, it has to include the huge emitters. China India. How can we unilaterally disarm and let them spew out pollution? It has to include everybody, and that's what this administration is not doing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Miller, we turn to you regarding climate change, science, and compelling data on both sides. Maybe the debate's going to rage on for decades to come. Specifically, what is the United States doing right with respect to climate change, and where are we getting it wrong?
Briefly, we haven't signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. That's an international treaty. That's a good thing. One of the things we're doing very wrong is this Obama administration has done a lot of subsidizing of green energy, which has cost this country hundreds of millions of dollars. It's called crony capitalism on steroids, effectively. It's not the market at work. It's rewarding those that actually are creating a lot of those regulations we just heard about that are slowing down this economy. We need to make sure that we're working for the people. And in this particular question, I'm the only one standing on the stage that says that at least consistently, that man-made global warming, the science on it, is inconclusively. Both of my opponents sitting here on this stage have made statements making it clear that at one time or another, they've endorsed the concept of anthropogenic or man-made global warming. Mr. Sullivan, I'll start with you, and I'm sure you might want to rebut this, but you said this to the Scandinavian Renewable Energy Forum in Oslo, Norway. This was back in 2008. Our climate change challenges stem primarily from a common source, an over-reliance on hydrocarbons as the world's primary form of energy. That doesn't sound like an all of the above policy. That sounds like somebody that doesn't like hydrocarbons. And again, at the Press Roundtable in Berlin, Germany, August 10th, 2007, on the climate issue, we want to underscore the seriousness with which we take this initiative. It will be the beginning of a process by which we hope to work with the major economies to achieve greenhouse gas reduction goal. Mr. Treadwell, same thing. This was testimony before the U.S. House Committee on Foreign Affairs, March 25th, 2009. And the global dialogue on climate change, Arctic research is warning us now that Arctic feedbacks already observed in the loss of sea ice and release of stored carbon and acidification of the ocean are dramatically raising the bar for global climate mitigation strategy the world seeks to agree on in Copenhagen later this year. Now, of course, you're telling us something different. APRM on July 10th, this was just last week, I think you talked about global warming. You made the comment that emissions from, or I should say, you stated that I believe the government's role at this point is to move technology along to make energy cleaner, which suggests that you may endorse actually the green energy type programs that the Obama administration was supporting over much of the last several years.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miller. So time to rebut. Mr. Treadwell is looking at me, Mr. Sullivan, if you would like to rebut for a moment, and then we can move to Mr. Treadwell.
Sure. All right, so Joe, when I said to Congress, Arctic research is warning us now that Arctic feedbacks already observed from the loss of sea ice, that's non-human climate change. And the point I was making, very simply, is this, is what's coming out of tundra ponds, what's coming out from changing of that, from changing of sea ice, not human-induced, is actually causing faster change than some of the others. I explained that to you once. And if I have to explain it to you again, I'd be happy to sit down and buy you coffee. That's the point. Now, you know, you cannot pretend the science does not exist.
Yes.
Mr. Miller, 1 minute.
So, I'm glad for this exchange because you and I have a different perception on things. You said in that testimony in 2009, you were talking about a mitigation strategy.
I was saying the world is doing a mitigation strategy, and they better pay attention to what is coming out of the earth first.
The mitigation strategy obviously means human involvement. And not only that, you reinforced that last week on July 10th, where you said, again, quote, I believe government's role at this point should be to move technology along to make energy cleaner, reflecting again that you believe in a mitigation strategy that involves those type of processes. And so this is the problem that we face all the time, and we've talked about this before on the law of the sea tree. We may talk about that more tonight, where you have changed dramatically your position. Casey Reynolds made the comment, this was a year and a half ago, I think, where he said, wait 10 minutes and he will change his position on anything. This is yet another area where you've had a lifetime of research, where you've had one position, and now today you're expressing another. And we'll talk again about some of these other areas later.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Sullivan's feeling lonely. Mr. Sullivan,
I'm feeling a little lonely over here.
That's it. All right, you got 1 minute, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, so listen, Joe, I worked in the Bush administration. They had views. I was not the point person on climate at all. Sometimes you go, you focus on certain initiatives. I was the guy in that administration who was focused on very much increasing energy in the Caspian region, keeping it away from the Russians, oil and gas. Just like I'm at this table, the candidate who's got the strongest record of putting together strategies to dramatically increase hydrocarbon and energy development throughout the state of Alaska, whether it's in Cook Inlet or on the North Slope or at Point Thompson. So I'll stand by my record very, very strongly on increasing energy and being very focused on increasing hydrocarbons. As a matter of fact, our campaign from the get-go has been talking about the huge opportunities with regard to the energy renaissance that's happening in America that we need to lead in Alaska. With regard to the initiative that you mentioned, that was an initiative by the Bush White House that was trying to make sure if there was any kind of global deal that it would keep China and India in it, while at the same time we were always fighting cap and trade and carbon tax, which the European Union and many other countries throughout the world were pushing. So this initiative that you're talking about here, to me, is exactly what the current administration is not doing, right? We need to make sure that any kind of global deal includes the huge other countries, the major economies. That was what this initiative was.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. All nice and clear. We can move on to something a little less controversial, Obamacare. Proving to be a complete disaster, say many. That said, the cost of health care is a major consideration for many across America and here in Alaska. Other than a government takeover of 1/6 of the nation's economy, what do you see as a solution to what are obviously flaws in the U.S. healthcare system? And I guess just as an aside to that, would you support a full repeal of Obamacare? Mr. Miller, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that we have to fully repeal it. And right now we need to speak honestly about where we're at politically. We've got a president who's not going to sign off on that. So you've got to end up with a 2/3 override. You aren't going to get that out of the House or Senate, but I certainly support it. I think the best luck that we have is by pushing for our allies in the House especially to defund Obamacare. That can be done unilaterally by the House of Representatives. This is not some sort of minor issue that we should compromise on. It's something that could eventually take over almost 20% of the U.S. economy. It's already taking away our choice. I talked earlier about expanding government and loss of liberty. This is a perfect example where we've had an expansion of government, and by the way, also the cronies were part of that process. Remember those insurance companies? Those are the only real winners with Obamacare. They're guaranteed it. And why? Because this infection that we have in D.C. of specialized interests that are impacting our elected leaders. Many of whom, even before they become elected representatives, you can see where those forces play out. And I encourage you to look at funding sources and making your determination as to who's going to act according to those principles instead of yours. But Obamacare, when we get rid of it, there are all sorts of free market solutions that we can focus on. One, we've got to get you, the decision maker, back in the free enterprise system, where you're making a cost-benefit analysis when you go out and you buy health care. You can't have somebody in the middle of it making the decision for you. You need to go out and say, this is what service I want. It offers the best quality at the least price. And there are ways that the federal government, we can actually have incentives to help out with that. We can tax incentivize, for example, health savings accounts. Not the old kind that you guys may or may not be used to, but those that you actually keep year after year after year, where you aren't basically incentivized to waste your money at the end of the year, but you can keep it at the end of the year. If you die, your estate or your descendants can keep that account. It's something that causes you not to go out and waste money, but spend it in a way that you believe is best for you and your health. We can also tax incentivize a major catastrophic plan, so you aren't caught holding the bag if you have a major issue that takes place in your healthcare future. And then, of course, also getting rid of those barriers across state lines that don't allow us to have healthcare plans that can be more competitive across the United States. So those are some market solutions that absolutely repeal, and if not that, defund.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Treadwell, to you next. Regarding Obamacare, what do you see as a potential solution to flaws that exist in the United States healthcare system, and would you support a full repeal of Obamacare?
Yes. Keep your doctor, dump your senator. Let me say this, Chris. I lost my wife to cancer in 2002. I saw the best and the worst of our healthcare system then. And if you like what the VA is doing, if you like lines of DMV, welcome to Obamacare, because that's what's coming. We have to repeal it now. And I understand the mechanics that Joe was talking about. Frankly, we have to defund it. And I stood with Ted Cruz and argued quite often last September when he was making his goal line stand that we had to defund Obamacare. Now, I also believe that we have a role for government in healthcare, and that's basically in research and development. You know, there are diseases out there that we need to find cures for. Cancer is one of them. There are many others. And the government does play a very good role there in research. I believe that we have a system now that was not only one of the largest tax increases ever, but it's telling the young people, and there's young people in this audience, that you can't save the money for retirement. You can't save the money for your down payment because you've got to pay for insurance you don't need. It's time to fix that. And I agree, I have always, in my companies, had medical savings accounts and encouraged that. The system we have now is geared toward getting us to a single payer system where government will control everything. I believe in the market. I believe in producing more competition. I agree with what Joe has said about the insurance companies. He had a chance to say it first. And the fact is that catastrophic health care, good research on the part of government, and tax incentives to help people take care of themselves.
All right, thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, you next. Obamacare, complete disaster, many say, take over 1/6 of the national economy. What do you see are potential solutions to our flawed U.S. healthcare system, and would you support a full repeal of Obamacare?
Yes, I would. But let me first make the point, Chris, that affordable care, access to affordable care, is a hugely important issue. It's a hugely important issue for Alaskans, for Americans. So the issue that's been raised, that's been joined, is something that we need to address. You know, I'm the candidate, though, standing here when Mark Begich was the 60th vote to pass Obamacare. I was your Attorney General who sued to stop it. And as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just reflexive. I sat down with a small team of attorneys and we powered through this thing. It took weeks, 2,200 pages, incredible. You know, what it wasn't healthcare reform, it was legislative malpractice because nobody read it. And this is what the problem is in Washington. These giant, comprehensive reforms that nobody understands and nobody reads. So to me, the symbol of Obamacare is much deeper than just with regard to healthcare. It's also much deeper because it relates to this broader issue of the rule of law, that the president is shredded. They have changed Obamacare 30 times, unilaterally. The president, under Article 2, has to faithfully execute the laws. He can't change it, and yet he does that. So Obamacare has been a disaster in so many ways. It's killing jobs. It's also not doing what it promised to do in terms of increasing care, access to care, decreasing costs. So what do we need to do? We can't just say repeal it. It needs to be replaced with some good ideas. The important ideas are to make sure that the decision making with regard to critical healthcare issues are between a patient and a family and a doctor. And right now, Obamacare has turned that on its head with regard to the federal government involved. So yes, there's market-based ideas. The one thing that hasn't been mentioned is tort reform. To keep the costs of healthcare down, you have to have tort reform. And I'll make one other point on the lawsuit we brought. We didn't win on the individual mandate, but what we did win on was the 10th Amendment argument with regard to Medicaid expansion. That was a huge victory for the Constitution, for individual liberty, and that's why I'm proud to have been one of the AGs who led that suit trying to stop Obamacare.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. You might as well keep your microphone warm there. We haven't landed on you first yet, so we'll turn back to you for this next question. Okay. National security concerns arrived on all of our doorsteps on that fateful morning of September 11, 2001. As a result, many liberties are being set aside for the sake of national security, from NSA snooping on U.S. citizens to the invasion of privacy at our nation's airports. How can Americans remain both safe and free with your being a senator? Go ahead, please.
Well, look, you mentioned 9/11. I think it changed a lot of people's lives. It certainly changed my life with regard to what happened in terms of the direction of where I was going. I was an attorney and a reserve officer in Anchorage running a Marine Recon unit. You know, the rest of my life for a number of years was focused on defending my country, either as a Marine or as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, all in response to the fact that our country had been attacked. And what I was doing was what hundreds of other Alaskans did with their lives at that time. But to me, the issue is whatever we do, and I think we've lost this, particularly domestically, it has to be rooted in the Constitution. It has to be. And the NSA has not had the oversight that it needed. Mark Baggett's another one of these areas where he's been asleep at the switch. Fortunately, there are cases that are now going through the court system that are going to get us to the proper point, particularly on the Fourth Amendment. No matter what liberties we're trying to protect in terms of security, having security by undermining our liberty and our Constitution is not real security at all. And to me, that's the key with regard to domestic surveillance, with regard to domestic security, critical oversight that's not happening, and making sure things are rooted in the Constitution. You know, we need to focus more on the bad guys, not the good guys. The good guys are us. And yet, there's a lot of bad guys out there. And to me, one of the things that we do need to continue to do is we need to stay engaged. There's this idea out there among some Republicans, hey, we lift up the drawbridges, the world will go on, we'll be safe. Wrong. To me, we need to be engaged. And if we're out there in foreign lands, taking out terrorists who want to do our country harm, trust me, I'm all for that. We need to stay engaged, but we need to base our domestic security in the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Miller, national security in a post-9/11 world, giving up and trading liberties for security, from NSA snooping on U.S. citizens, invasion of our privacy at the airports. How can Americans remain both safe and free, in your opinion?
This is a critically important issue for me. It's in one of the top issues that I see as needing to be addressed at the federal level. We are on the verge of actually a form of tyranny right now in this country. Your federal government basically records virtually everything that you say on cell phone. A number of NSA whistleblowers have said that. It's surveying, outside of the Fourth Amendment, all sorts of people, including political candidates, senior military leaders. It is atrocious that we as a people are sitting back and allowing this to happen. And I think it's also atrocious that we have people standing on the stage that were actually part of the surveillance state. The Bush administration initiated much of what we see in the surveillance state today. And in fact, Mr. Sullivan worked for one of the agencies that actually helped bring that to the fore.
I'm going to
rebut
Obama
that.
Administration, it's not accurate at all.
John Negroponte has donated twice. He's the Director of National Intelligence to Mr. Sullivan's campaign. He's a significant advocate for the surveillance state. He's investing in a candidate for a reason. There are others like him. The fact is, we can't pansy around on this issue. You know, Angela Merkel said that what we're doing is worse than the East Germans, the Stasi. That ought to make all of us sit up and take recognition that we're moving into an era in this country where we cannot give up those fundamental freedoms in exchange for some sense of security. Now, there are things we can do that a lot of people won't take a firm stance on. And I don't know where Mr. Sullivan stands on this. Looks like he's going to rebut me, so I'll throw this out there. We need to make sure that we're zero tolerance on amnesty. And that means securing the border first. Now, we're going to talk about all these security concerns. Don't you think we ought to shut down the border?
That's right. Yeah.
And you know what? At the last debate, this is over at East Diamond High School, I asked the crowd of about 300 people, I said, who in this crowd, Republicans, supports amnesty? One hand raised. You know what? The leadership of the Republican Party wants amnesty. They don't want to secure the border and really address those security concerns. So watch out for who you elect. Are they going to be part of the problem? Or are they going to just continue to move us toward more of the surveillance state, more tyranny, more degradation of this country?
So we'll get first Mr. Treadwell. We'll give you an opportunity, and then we'll honor your rebut, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you.
Mr. Treadwell, if you respond to
The
that.
Fourth Amendment of the Constitution is part of the Bill of Rights that was insisted on by freedom-fighting Americans before we began acting under the Constitution that came out of Philadelphia. and it basically says the government does not spy on Americans. I worked during the Cold War with our national security apparatus. Then the rule at the intelligence community was we do not spy on Americans. Now along comes this business where you can soak up everything you can and the entire ocean of data, and the government is violating its own Fourth Amendment. They have no right to know what the phone calls were. They have no right to do what Homeland Security did with a straight face, which said they could have a sensor at the beginning of the road to the Homer Spit or at the driveway to the Land's End to know who came here tonight. That is none of their business, and they proposed that in 2014. I will join Rand Paul's lawsuit to turn this over. I will work to reform intelligence seriously, not just the papering over that the president did with after the Snowden revelations. I will do what I've done as head of the Aerospace States Association when I went to the drone industry, and I was actually asked to be their keynote speaker, and I made it very clear, if you guys do not respect privacy, you should not have an industry, and you will not have an industry. And then we came up with standards for all 50 states because the FAA had said to me, we do safety, you guys do privacy, and I've helped every other state, as well as our own. Representative Shelley Hughes has worked on this to protect privacy here with this new technology. I am concerned very much about Dan's cavalier statement. You know, we got to go after the bad guys and, you know, not go after the good guys. The fact is that the way they're doing that is collecting everything and then only going after your stuff if they get a warrant. That's not what the government should be doing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, would you still like to reply?
Absolutely.
Go ahead, you got a minute.
So Joe, I just, the notion that somehow I was part of the domestic surveillance state is a ridiculous statement, okay? Here's what I did after 9/11, okay? I was working in one of three places, the United States Marine Corps, which last time I checked was a pretty darn good defender of the U.S. Constitution. Hoorah! Hoorah! Thank you very much. The U.S. State Department, where I was focused on, among other things, international economic issues, terrorist finance issues, sanction issues. I was a lead guy going around the world to try and get companies to not invest in the Iranian oil and gas sector. Why? So we could put pressure on them to prevent them from their nuclear arms program. And I worked at the National Security Council, not agency, council staff, the White House, on international economic issues. Zero to do with this. Was I involved in trying to go after the enemies of my country? You better believe it. And I still am, as a U.S. Marine. But the notion that somehow I was part of a domestic surveillance state and setting that up. And let me just make one other point about donors, right? You mentioned this. I put out what I'm doing with regard to my vision for Alaska and for the country. Less government, more freedom, launching an economic and energy renaissance, protecting our veterans. That's what I tell people who I want their support. Your value system might be different than mine, but just because someone is donating to me doesn't mean that that buys my vote on anything. And so, to me, my record on protecting this country, serving in my country, which I still do, and I honor your service, is strong, and I had zero to do with any kind of notion of setting up a domestic surveillance state in America. And you know, you keep repeating it, and it's absolutely fundamentally false.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Sir,
Mr. Miller, we'll put 60 seconds on the clock.
Yeah, the problem here is that the surveillance state's a multi-headed hydra. I mean, when he admits in his answer that he's part of the terrorist finance, cutting off finances of terrorism, what do you think that involves? It involves bank surveillance. It involves knowing what you're doing in your banks. It means that in many cases, Fourth Amendment violations. This is not something that I'm accusing Dan of constructing himself, not at all. This is a problem of the federal government with many people within the federal government, within the Bush administration, within the Obama administration, ignoring their oath of office and to the Constitution and violating the Fourth Amendment, justifying, oh, we're going against the terrorists, we're trying to cut off their finances. In reality, our founders intended the Constitution to protect your liberties. And you know, there are other things that we can be doing. We can have a laser-like focus. When our enemies know that they do something to us, we will vaporize them. That's right. But we don't have to violate the Fourth Amendment in the process. And it's this type of justification that, oh, I was just involved around the edges, that's sinking this country.
No, I wasn't involved around the edges. I mean, I was proud of my work on trying to make sure that the terrorists who are killing our soldiers, our Marines, don't get the funding overseas, which is where I was focused, to do harm to our citizens and to you. And you better believe that what they do in terms of their ability to act is based on their ability to have money.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
Are you against cutting off Al-Qaeda?
Well, we've got a rebuttal to the
I guess I got to go and do a sort of.
Well, let's do 30 seconds, and then we'll come back to you for 30 seconds. I feel like I'm doing an auction. Mr. Miller, 30 seconds.
Well, I'm going to have to go on Mr. Treadwell here in a second, or people will accuse me beating up on Dan.
Oh, we've got all night.
That's all right.
I thought your slogan was "Don't tread on mead."
Imitation is the best form of flattery. You know, I serve as a combat veteran. I respect your service as well. But the point that I'm making, Dan, is not that you're responsible for all of this, or not that you intend well. I think most of the people in government, including John Negroponte and Karl Rove, who's supporting you, intend well with respect to security of this country. They don't want to see their kids and grandkids blown up. But the point is, I don't want to live under tyranny. That's the point. And you know what? There's risk associated with a free nation. And we can't go around supporting those in the Bush administration or supporting the things that are done because we're getting rid of terrorism and treading on those fundamental liberties, because we won't have much of a country left living for in the event that the type of tyranny that they really intend comes home to roost.
All right, Mr. Miller, thank you. Back over to you, Mr.
And Joe, I appreciate the comment. I think everybody here wants to protect the country, protect the Constitution. I certainly do. And I'm just saying, in a dangerous world, overseas, one of the key things we can do is to go after terrorists. Okay? That's what we can do. And, you know, we can do that in a way that protects our Constitution, protects our citizens. And I'm proud to have been someone who has done that, because you get rid of their money and they can't build the IEDs that have been killing all our soldiers overseas or blowing up the World Trade Center. Let's not be naive here. I'm very focused on the Constitution, nothing to do with domestic surveillance, but you better believe I think it's important to try and work to cut off financing to the terrorist groups that want to do all of us harm, and our citizens overseas and our soldiers and Marine overseas. And to me, that's very important.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Mr. Treadwell, there you sit right in the center, all alone, left out. Let's move on to fisheries for a moment. Major part of Alaska's economy. All three of you can agree on that, no doubt. What are some solutions that you would offer to some of the major dilemmas facing our Alaskan fishermen? And if you could touch on any or all commercial, subsistence, charter, and sport. Mr. Treadwell.
Well, thank you, Chris. I have 40 years of history in Alaska, and quite a bit of it has to do with making sure that we have control of our fisheries, the good science to manage our fisheries, pushing back on Obama's ocean policy and other things that would divert resources from managing our fisheries, and helping to build our fisheries by bringing power and ownership of our fisheries home. I started with the 200-mile limit. I was a foot soldier, just a guy hired by Wally Hickel to help make the case to throw the foreigners out. Later on in the Hickel administration, I was part of getting us this community development quotas. As your Lieutenant Governor, as chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, I've been pushing for the science. This is Chinook News. This is talking about the $30 million of research that the governor put forward on initiatives of several people, including Representative Seaton in this room, myself, and others, to make sure that we had the research to figure out what's happening to our Chinook population. Furthermore, and despite, kind of crazy little press releases from my opponent to my right, I have gone and confronted the Russians several times because they are telling us they have zero bycatch, and that is baloney. And we have made sure that the agenda for each of our scientific consultations coming up, no matter what's happening, between us in the large geopolitical area is addressing the needs of Alaskans and their fish. So, very honestly, here in Cook Inlet, with what's been happening with the charter boats versus the guides, or individual boats versus the guides, it's worrisome. And I think the federal process really needs to come home to the state wherever possible. Up in the Kenai River, I made the tough decision, respecting our Constitution on the SetNet initiative. It's being reviewed by the courts. We'll do what the courts tell us to do, but we've worked very, very hard to bring parties together and to get the science done here properly in Cook Inlet. And offshore, we put pressure on others to reduce bycatch and to make sure we have the right science, because about 50,000 Alaskans work in our fisheries, and it's very important that we address their problems.
All right, thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Fisheries, Mr. Sullivan. Major dilemmas facing Alaskan fishermen. If you'd address commercial, subsistence, charter, and/or sport, or all of the above.
Well, Chris, it's a hugely important part of the economy. I mean, I think it's the second most prominent part of the Alaska economy. One of the things that I've been doing as a candidate is meeting with all the different users groups. And, from a federal perspective, I think reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act is important to move forward with that, to continue to have the commitment on the 200-mile limit, the objective approach with regard to science, which is so critical. But I also think it's important that we need to look at where the federal government is not providing opportunities. So I think in terms of what's happening in terms of abundance, the federal government and the state should be working very closely together. Science-based decisions with regard to abundance, but not political decisions on all the different users groups. But I also think that the federal government should not be limiting opportunities with regard to fisheries. And I'll give you a couple examples. When I was your Attorney General, it was the abuse, what we thought, of the Endangered Species Act, where they were listing different species that were dramatically limiting our fisheries opportunities to fish. And when I was your Attorney General, I took action to delist the Steller sea lion. And we did that. That was the first time that we actually went on offense to remove a species from the Endangered Species Act that dramatically improved the opportunities for our fisheries to get out from under those restrictions. We did the same thing here when the beluga whale was listed. We took that to court to try to get that decision reversed with regard to helping our fisheries. So to me, working closely with the federal government, particularly on the science, is critical, but also making sure we don't have a federal government that's limiting the opportunities. So I'm going to continue to work on that. Fisheries will be a big part of my focus as your U.S. Senator, and we're going to continue to focus on these very important issues to our economy and to all Alaskans. Big fishery interests, small interests, but also Alaskans putting fish on the table. It's so critical to all elements of the society here. So that's what I'm going to be focused on.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. And we turn to you, Mr. Miller. Fisheries, big part of Alaska's economy, as you know. Major dilemmas face Alaskan fishermen from commercial, subsistence, charter, and sport. Would you address those issues, please?
So Homer, the halibut capital of the world. Doesn't seem like so much anymore, does it? One of my first fishing trips up here in Alaska in 1909 occurred out of Homer. And I remember that trip quite well. It was an overnight trip, so we'd get 4 halibut, large halibut. It's kind of a different world today. My good friend Charlie Larson and I come down here and fish every once in a while in his nice boat, and we're lucky to get large fish. Much of what we see today, at least in the Homer area, is a consequence of a fishery that a lot of us don't understand all the consequences to. But the biggest importance that I hear, and I spent a little bit of time today talking to interested parties in this area about the fisheries challenges that especially the charter services face, is that they want to be heard. They need to have a voice. They don't want to see domination by the trawlers and the other industry representatives that seem to have complete and total say over what things happen and what things don't in the fisheries. And it's important, if you choose to elect me and send me to DC, for me to make sure that you do be heard. You know, this state and its constitution has an important component with natural resources. It's called the Maximum Benefit Clause, where we are able to use our resources. And of course, we're talking in part the federal fisheries here, but we want to make sure that those resources are used for the maximum benefit of all. And I've had really quite the blessing in the state of being part of at least 2 of the 4 major areas. When I was out in Toke for about 4 years, a little bit over 4 years as the magistrate, we took part in the subsistence fishery. That was our main source of meat. We still today get a lot of our meat out of subsistence. And I wish I was down here doing some of that right now, but instead I'm here at the debate because it's an important thing for all of us in our future. But the fact of it is that's an important component to Alaskans. And you talk to the people on the Yukon about what's going on with the king salmon. All of us have varying ideas as to what's going on. One of the things I can assure you of is I recognize that the fisheries is a commons. I have a master's degree in natural resource economics from the University of Alaska. And one of the things we study is precisely that, the commons, where there is a role for obviously government action to ensure that we manage it for maximum resource. And again, if you vote for me and send me to DC, I can assure you that I'll represent all interests and listen to all interests that are involved in that very important part of the Alaska economy. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Miller. All right, we'll just reverse the order and stay with you, Mr. Miller. Simple observer can see that we're at the brink of World War III. The Middle East is literally on fire. What level of support should the U.S. be showing to our allies in Israel right now?
Israel is the only democracy in the region. No matter what your motivation is for supporting Israel, there's always a logical benefit to it. I've been to Israel twice. In fact, one of the reasons why my son ended up going to West Point is he saw the real security concerns in that nation. Shortly after visiting there, he chose to apply for West Point just because it became real world to him. I mean, here's a nation that has enemies on all sides. We sat in a town outside of the Gaza Strip, which on a almost weekly basis has rockets falling on it. Israel is basically the point of the spear with respect to what's going on in the Middle East today. I don't agree with everything Israel does, but it is a stalwart ally, and we have to stand behind it. But I got to tell you, why we're at where we're at today with the Middle East on the brink, as the question put at World War III, is the fact that we have an administration in DC, Obama, that seems to be at every step doing things to damage the interests of this country. I mean, it is pathetic what he did in Libya, pathetic what he did in Egypt, pathetic what he's doing in Syria. And now we have ISIS, which, believe it or not, I heard a report that they now have some M1 tanks. Can you imagine M1 tanks? I just saw some Hummers on a video clip of ISIS. ISIS, by the way, is reported to have actually shot some rockets out of Gaza Strip into Israel. This is a common enemy that we have to stand against, and this is not just simply a regional conflict. I mean, this is something which could be worldwide in impact. And it's something that, because these folk want to do us harm, we have to address in a very severe fashion and support those that are actually defending against it. But we're in this mess because of the way that this foreign policy was conducted, starting with the Bush administration and going into the Obama administration. Our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan has left an utter disaster. Now, I went into the Persian Gulf. We got in, we got out. Left some things undone. But the fact of the matter is where we're at today, people that are in those countries, even those that are in the free areas, supposedly, of those countries, are under less freedom today than in other areas of the Arab world. Look, for example, the Christian minority in Iraq is virtually gone because of the type of government we left there. Try to proselytize as a Christian in Afghanistan right now. See where that gets you. We made some major issues. They didn't all start with Obama, but he certainly has been the catalyst to the nightmare that we're in front of today.
All right, Mr. Miller. Mr. Treadwell, you're next on the list here. Middle East on fire, as many are saying, at the brink of World War III. What level of support would and should the United States be showing, with you, Senator, to our allies in Israel?
Very strong support. I too have made 2 trips to Israel. I took William and Natalie and Tim and some other close friends there last year. We went in through Jordan, came up past where Jesus was baptized, visited Jerusalem, met with the Israeli government as I had in 2000, and did this on my own nickel. I see a country which is the democracy in the Middle East, which has been defending itself and developing the technology to defend itself despite problems with the United States where they haven't wanted to advance missile defense. And it's the Iron Dome that is keeping Israel safe right now. I worked very, very hard on that technology. We had a situation in Alaska in the late 90s where the Clinton administration did not want to build the missile defense that could defend all 50 states. I led the effort to get a bill through the legislature, to make it a national issue, helped get us out of the ABM treaty. And when the U.S. was stuck on stupid, we turned to our allies in Israel and in Asia to help advance that technology, and we can see the benefit of it today. The other thing that we have to do in the medium term, but starting right here, right now, is we have to be tough on Russia. Russia has been, this is a proxy war, and don't believe it isn't. Don't believe they're not laughing up their sleeve as ISIS goes into Iraq. Don't believe they're not laughing in their sleeve as we struggle internally ourselves to figure out what to do in Syria. Don't believe that they're not laughing in their sleeve as the Arab Spring turns into an Arab hurricane. It is an awful situation. The United States gave Russia veto after veto after veto on our foreign policy, and that has been the weakness that has invited some of what we're seeing today. So we have to stand with Israel. We have to work very hard to bring peace back to that region and help Israel build strong neighbors who have economic reasons to pursue peace rather than pursuing the bloodshed and the hatred and the racial strife that we've had for a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, what level of support should the U.S. be showing to our allies in Israel?
Very strong support. I'm a staunch supporter of Israel, also traveled there, but I've also worked on issues at the highest levels of our government with regard to economic cooperation with the Israeli government. That's one way to ensure you have a strong ally, is to have a strong economy and a strong economic relationship with them. But also, as I mentioned earlier, on the issue of Iran sanctions. This is Israel's biggest threat right now, an Iranian nuclear power. And it's a huge threat to the United States, and it's a huge threat to all of our allies in that region of the world. And what's happening right now is we have an administration that is chasing a deal with Iran. We have a senator in Mark Begich who again seems asleep at the wheel on this critical issue, not only to our allies, but to our own country. And to me, that's something where we need much stronger action in the Congress. When I was working on these Iran sanction issues globally, different countries, different companies, one of the strengths of my argument was U.S. sanctions with regard to Iran and potentially other companies that were investing in their oil and gas sector. To me, that's the kind of leadership and strength we need. Right now, we're not doing that at all. But this brings up a much broader point with regard to what's going on in the world. We have an administration that within 5.5 years has somehow gotten to the place where our friends no longer trust us and our adversaries no longer fear us. And nowhere is that more happening than in the Middle East right now. It's also an indication where weakness, which we show, is provocative. And we're seeing that everywhere in different parts of the world. To me, it all relates back to the issue of American exceptionalism. I believe that this is the greatest country, the biggest force for good in the world. We have an administration that early on declared that it didn't believe that. Probably the first president in the country's history who didn't believe that. And when you don't believe in the unique nature of this country internationally, you are not going to be able to influence friends or influence potential adversaries. And that's what we need back in Washington.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. All right, Mr. Treadwell, we'll ask you this next question first. Since the Roe versus Wade decision by the United States Supreme Court in 1973, approximately 56 million babies have been aborted. Was Roe v. Wade, was that decision a mistake?
Yes. I believe it was a mistake, and I believe it's outlived its time and any argument that it should continue. But I'll say this, I happened to be a U.S. Senate page in 1973, and I was in Washington when Roe v. Wade came down. And sometimes in public service, when you just get started, all you do is carry papers around. And I remember Senator Jim Buckley, somebody who Dan has worked with, actually put in the first constitutional amendment to overturn Roe v. Wade, and I carried it to the rostrum. But my own personal feelings about this come because my mother got pregnant out of wedlock. She had an ability to go get an abortion. She didn't. She instead had her son, and that's me, and I thank God every day I'm alive. I can tell you on this issue, as a parent of a teenager, when the Supreme Court of Alaska said we can't get parental permission for an underage child to have an abortion, you can at least have parental notification, and our legislature was stuck on stupid. I put up the first money, brought together the allies, we got that effort together. Joe and I worked on that, and several others, to get that through, and I've helped bird dog that through as Lieutenant Governor so that parental notification is the law of the land. We've worked very hard on the issue of medical necessity because Alaska was paying for too many abortions that were not necessary, and the Supreme Court again told us that our state is one of the few states where the Hyde Amendment doesn't apply because the way the Supreme Court read our privacy clause in our Constitution. We've now passed regulations, which I signed almost immediately when they came to my desk, and we've gotten laws passed through the legislature to try to ratchet down paying for it. Because I'll just tell you this, we need fire departments, we need search and rescue, we need EMTs, and to see our government spend a dime taking away life rather than trying to protect life, to me makes no sense at all. And I will stand up proudly when others will say, don't even talk about this, to stand up for life.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, the question is to you. Was Roe v. Wade, was that decision a mistake?
Well, I think constitutionally it was incorrect. And so, yes, I do think it was a mistake. Like the other candidates here, I'm a strongly pro-life candidate. You know, everybody comes to that decision different ways. For me, it's a father of 3 teenage daughters who early on, my oldest, with my wife, we had a rather difficult pregnancy, and you see things that really, really affect you for the rest of your life. And I look at my daughters now and just think that, you know, what a beautiful gift life is. So with regard to working on the issue, when I was your Attorney General, I was the one who worked to defend the parental notification issue that Meade was talking about there earlier. And I also think that this is an issue that is a broader issue with regard to what's happening with regard to our federal government. You have a federal government that in many ways is going the opposite way. You look at what's in Obamacare, where they are now requiring institutions, religious institutions and other institutions, to actually move forward with regard to issues like abortion that are fundamentally against the belief of many, many Americans. And to me, this is a critical issue of this assault on religious liberty that we're seeing under this administration. Fortunately, we've had some recent Supreme Court cases that are pushing back on that, but to me, religious liberty is one of the critical issues that we need to be focused on with this administration, and that's something I'll do as your U.S. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Was that decision a mistake, in your opinion?
It was a mistake, it was unconstitutional, but it's still the law of the land. And why is that? Because of Republican Supreme Court justices. That's a fact. And yet every election cycle, what do we hear? We hear Republicans talking about how pro-life they are. Virtually every primary in the nation, you can hear the same thing said. And yet, what happens in the halls of Congress? We end up confirming justices who really don't stand for life. And as a result, 56 million dead, generations dead, all sorts of ills to this society because we've killed the most defenseless. And it's something which is a zero tolerance issue for me. I'm unequivocally pro-life. Now, Mr. Treadwell and I had a discussion at the last debate on this, and it boiled down to, and I'm happy to hear Mr. Sullivan state that he believes that Roe v. Wade is not constitutional, because both Mr. Treadwell and Mr. Sullivan actually stopped pro-life initiatives from coming before you, the voters, and both of them hid behind the courts in making that determination. They did. And so if you see this as something that's unconstitutional, if you see this as something that is so dramatically important to the future of the country, you've got to make the tough decisions, even if it means you aren't going to actually be, the most popular necessarily in legal circles. I take a lot of heat for this position. I think that when you take an oath to the Constitution, it's to the Constitution. It's not to these activist decisions. Like, for example, my professor of constitutional law at Yale Law School, Akil Amar, He said that this is one of the poorest reasons decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court. And the danger of this is when we create these things out of whole cloth that do such dramatic damage to our country, it does damage in other ways as well. If the Supreme Court's going to be activists on that issue, what other issues is it going to be activists on? Right. Well, creating all these rights that aren't enumerated in the Constitution, infringing on your liberties, expanding the Commerce Clause so virtually everything you touch is governed by the federal government. See, there's a connection, even on life, to this overexpanse of the federal government. And we have to make sure that we elect people, again, going back to the last 34 years, where we've had Republicans in charge and able to stop this. We have to make sure that we elect people that are going to be uncompromising and don't just give us rhetoric.
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Sullivan, will be a minute to respond.
I just wanted to tell you, we had an exchange in our last debate on this, and you know, the Attorney General that you were referencing was not me at the time that Meade and the other Attorney General made the decision. So your point on that, on the decision that you were debating with Meade in the last debate with regard to where I was the DNR commissioner.
Okay.
I'm just going to say this, Joe. We talked about that after the last debate. The initiative that I turned down was later backed up by our state Supreme Court as the appropriate decision. Now, that doesn't mean it's the best decision, but that's what the law says. And this young man who came in with an initiative took something very interesting in our Constitution, which has never been litigated before. And it says that all citizens have a natural right to life. It's in the preamble of our state Constitution. I agree with that. I believe in that. I kept the Attorney General up all night. I said, find me a way that you could defend that. Right? He couldn't. He said, I'll hire you outside lawyers. I went to some of the best right-to-life lawyers in the country, in the state. And they said this thing was not written right, and that's exactly what the Supreme Court said. And Joe, you misstate my position. You do this in a brochure again and again. I think you said to me in our conversation after the debate last time that you understood it wouldn't win. And the fact is that this should be litigated with an appropriately written initiative, and I'd like to see it come forward, and maybe you should put one forward.
Mr. Miller, we'll give you a minute to
I
respond.
need two. I've got to respond to both of them if I can.
I think you can do it in one. Let's
I'll
see what you can do.
Let me try to be a little bit speedy, but also clear. First of all, I'm not challenging either of you on your personal views. Let me make that clear. What this gets down to is whether or not you're going to take a stand. Whether, if you believe, for example, the Constitution provides for protection of life, whether you're going to stand up to an AG that says, oh, we can't win this. We've got to have men and women of principle that see this as such a high priority that they do that. Mr. Sullivan, with respect to you, I think you misunderstood what I said. There were two initiatives. The initiative that I referred to, that you actually struck down, was the Sanctity of Life initiative. This is a letter from you October 4th, 2010, where you turned it away, and at least your signature block is on this particular letter. It may have been an assistant attorney general who actually signed it. We've talked about that before with a stand your ground, and we may talk about that more tonight. But the fact of it is what we need today in government is not people that are going to be mushy. You know, I heard one of my good friends told me that one of the other problems that we have here in Homer is with halibut, that you know, they look fine on the outside, but they're all jelly on the inside. I think that's the problem that we have in politics as well.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Running down on the clock here and trying to be respectful of everybody's time here tonight, and still with you gentlemen and making it all the way down here. So many questions left to ask. Maybe I can try to merge some of the questions that are on our plate, but I'll ask two more, and then I'll turn it over to you, which I know you've been very bashful to engage with one another. We'll attempt to bring that down, bring the barriers down. So my last question, and that would be relevant to term limits on a national basis. As a senator, would you support term limits on a national basis for senators and congresspeople? And we'll start with you, Mr. Miller.
I support them, but keep in mind that's not all that we have to do. And one of the things I turn back to all the time is what happened in the 2010 and 2012 cycles. We elected a whole bunch of new folk to Congress, didn't we? You know, by some estimate, 90 or so people by 2012 in the Tea Party caucus. And yet when the debt ceiling vote rolled around, you could only muster 23 to vote against it. That wasn't a term limit issue, because a lot of those folk were new folk. That is a problem with compromise. Once you get to DC, what happens? Well, like my friend Huelskamp out of Kansas they yanked his appropriation seat away from him. Oh, you aren't going to bring anything back to Kansas because you did this. You've got to be able to make the hard choices because this country doesn't have a heck of a lot of time left. It doesn't. The solvency issue, the problem with liberties going away, the problem with the excuse of terrorism giving rise to reduction of our privacy, all of these factors are rolling together to shortchange the American people and to take away from we the people their right, given by God, to live under their fundamental freedoms.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I think that is the first answer tonight that hasn't received a bell.
I want to get to the candidate questions.
I hear you. Okay, Mr. Treadwell, we'll go to you. Term limits on a national basis for the House Representatives and Senators, and you say?
Yes, I support term limits on a national basis. I also support session limits. I believe congressmen should spend more time at home. This idea of a week a month with very short recesses doesn't make sense. Congress should get its work done and come out and spend time with the people who represent them. I believe that Congress should get its budget done by the beginning of the fiscal year. We don't do that anymore. I believe Congress should pass a budget the way it's described in the Constitution and taught in the civic books, and Congress is not living by that limit. And I have no interest in going to Congress to get any special perks, pensions, extra pay, or anything else, or to live under the laws any different than those that American citizens live under.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Sullivan, your stance on term limits.
I also agree on that with regard to term limits. As Meade said, on a national level, I think what we don't want to do with regard to a unilateral approach where Alaska does something and other states are not doing it, and you can potentially disadvantage the state and our representatives there. But to me, this issue is about career politicians. And we've been talking about $17 trillion in debt. And I agree, that is a bipartisan disaster for this country. And I think what's happening with regard to career politicians in Washington, they're much more focused about their next election than making the hard decisions to not have this huge budget deficit on our kids' backs. So it's much easier for them to kick the can down the road on spending cuts, on not growing this economy, when they can make decisions and ensure that they stay in office. So to me, what I'm trying to do is make sure Mark Begich has a one-term limit. And I think that's absolutely critical. So that's what we need in terms of politicians who are focused on not wanting to be there for life, but wanting to get there to get things done. And my record as your Attorney General, as your DNR Commissioner, has been focused on those kind of things. Looking at problems, looking at challenges, putting together strategies, and then relentlessly executing them. Sometimes they're popular, sometimes they're not popular. But it's been about action. Not conferences, not talk, not press releases, but about action that benefits our citizens, that helps us grow our economy. And to me, that's going to be my focus as your U.S. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. All right, my last question for you gentlemen. Let me just do this. Let me wrap a couple into one, and it's regarding national security, which we've already touched on, and I think everybody's spoken to it this evening. And so I'll wrap it up into one. It's tough. You're all Republicans standing here before us tonight, and it's tough to look at children of any age, of any ethnicity or origin coming into this country, ill, sick, huddled masses, etc., and saying, sorry, turn around and go back. However, we do have laws. We do need to enforce our border security. That said, we've also got Sergeant Andrew Tamarisi rotting in a Mexican prison who inadvertently crossed into to Mexico, and for some reason, unlike hundreds of thousands of other people, can't get back into the country without documentation. So my question is to you, as a senator, and with all seriousness, and in a very short minute, it's obviously very, very tough to answer, but what can we do to both be a compassionate people as a Republican Party and at the same time enforce laws that do involve turning children back home? And we'll start with you, Mr. Sullivan.
So, you know, Chris, I mean, we know as Americans we're a nation of immigrants. And I think we need to recognize that. It's one of our strengths, in my view. But we're also a nation of laws. And that's the big problem with what's going on at the border. We have a lawless approach to immigration. It's It's not very difficult to see what's happening. You have an administration that almost is inviting people through amnesty, which I am not for. Joe, just for clarification on that, since you twisted my view on that one, certainly. But you have an administration through lawlessness is encouraging what's going on at the border. And I'll tell you, when I talk about we're a nation of laws, we need to secure the border. Every other country seems to have that right. Why don't we have that right? That's where immigration reform begins. And let me tell you about the Marine. As a Marine, I take this issue personally. I think this is an affront to all Americans watching that sergeant sitting there. And I think the one thing that we're not seeing is the appropriate level of outrage with regard to the Obama administration. Where is the outrage with regard to what this young man is going through? So to me, that is a symbol of the border chaos. And what we need to do is secure the border. We also need to make a little bit more of an effort to get that young man out of jail. And by the way, one phone call from a senior administration official, the president, could do that. So that's where I'm focused on with regard to securing the border. But it is an issue where, look, I'll admit, it's a tragic situation with these children. And anyone who doesn't admit that, that's difficult. But we need to focus on Americans. And by the way, I think the best thing that we can do for these children is to reunite them with their families. That's the most humane thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Miller, report to you now.
Well, I think the reason we're at this position right now is because of decisions that have been made, again, by Republican administrations with regard to amnesty. We have all these inducements to come across the border, and so what more can we expect? Well, a lot more of what we've seen. Now, part of this, of course, is a specter that's been created by those that are for amnesty. And Mr. Sullivan, I'm glad that you suggested today that you're against amnesty. I'd be interested in seeing how you define that. But when you're supported by pro-amnesty groups like Karl Rove's group, as well as the Chamber of Commerce, which are on record for amnesty, and I include amnesty as being a pathway to citizenship, which you, Mr. Treadwell, has stated that you're for a limited pathway. You guys can rebut me all you want, but I'm just based upon what you said. And the fact is that when we have a Republican Party, and I don't mean to be harsh about this, but we've got to talk about it, a Republican Party where the leadership is for amnesty, and yet again, going back to Anchorage, not exactly the bastion of ultra-conservatism, and at our debate, one person out of 300 raised their hands and said they were for it, and yet the leadership says no. What is going on with that picture? Well, the reason why is because they get a lot of people to vote with the powers that are in play. And that includes, again, the Chamber, which is funding one of the candidates here. It includes a number of other donors. We could probably spend 3 or 4 minutes going through all your donors to back amnesty down. But I'm glad that you said that you're against amnesty, and I hope that you'll ferret that out a little bit and tell us whether or not that means 100% against amnesty. And we'll change our sheet, by the way, in fact, if you say that. But the fact is we can no longer have people that give us rhetoric. We've got to go back and look and see exactly what's behind them, because if not, when you wake up the next day, you're going to have somebody that's tearing down the borders, somebody that's actually out there bringing more illegals in. Now, when the president spends, what was his proposal, $5 billion to build detention centers? I mean, that's crazy. You could buy a first-class ticket for every kid that's here to send them back to their country of origin. The compassionate answer, Chris, to answer your question directly, is to make sure that the United States remains a bright, shining city on the hill. One that we show all the rest of the world how the free enterprise system works, so that they can create their own economies and they can create their own wealth, so that their children want to stay there and create a bright future for their families and their children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Treadwell.
Chris, let me tell you how dysfunctional Congress is today. We have a situation where 60,000 kids have come across the border because of a loophole in the law. And the president, who wants to get something through both houses, says let's spend money rather than let's fix the law. That's how crazy it is. For the same amount of time that it would take to move his money forward to do his detention centers and everything else, we could very simply say the law that says that people coming from a third country do not get to come in any more than people coming in from the second country across that border. And he should be changing that law. And Congress it's so dysfunctional right now. The Senate passed an immigration bill. I disagreed with that immigration bill. And Mark Begich voted for it. they're trying to slam amnesty down the throats of the House. The House said, well, you might look at splitting it up. But at this point, I do not support an immigration bill until we have a president who actually enforced the law. To finish on this situation, we have, Joe has said and made political hay out of the term amnesty, and tried. And I'd love to see you fix your bingo card, Joe. But the point, the point I'm getting at is that there are many, many different stories and many, many different categories of people involved in the immigration situation right now. There should be penalties for breaking the law. There should be certainty that the law will be enforced, and then we can move on. As far as the situation with Sergeant Tamarisi, all I have to say is this. The United States and Mexico are among the largest trading partners. We have a large trade relationship. We have huge activity going back and forth. And frankly, this is something that we have to get behind us very, very quickly. If he has violated laws in Mexico, we should be helping him get through that court process. But basically, I don't believe, from what I've heard and read, that he belongs there at all. And I agree with Dan. We've got to tell the Mexicans to draw a firm line.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gredwell.
Well, Joe, I'm just going to make a comment on a broader point here. You focused on a lot of my supporters, right? I also have the strongest number of supporters in terms of Alaskans donating to me of, I think, any candidate standing up here. What I've been trying to focus on is beating Mark Begich. And to me, the most important way to do that is to unite Republicans, different groups of Republicans. Does that mean everybody who supports me, I agree with all their principles? No, that's not, you assume a campaign contribution will buy a vote. That might be your value system. That's not my value system. What I'm trying to do is unite different groups of the Republican Party. And you mentioned one, you failed to mention one, another group, the Club for Growth. They've gotten behind me. Very fiscally conservative, one of the most fiscally conservative groups. You might remember them. They endorsed you in 2010. That's what I'm trying to do. Unite the party so we can beat Mark Begich. It doesn't mean I agree with everything that every donor has been focused on, but to me, that's a critical way that we, as Republicans and beyond, win in November, beat Mark Begich, take the Senate back, and take our country back.
Thank you, Mr. Dolan. Did you want to, we're about to get into those precious candidates.
I've got to make a couple of
comments. All right, let's hear it.
When we talk about, for example, Karl Rove, we aren't talking about a few dollars here and there. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar campaign in the state. Karl Rove is very pro-amnesty, as are others. They're supporting you to the tune of thousands, tens of thousands, even Paul Singer, I guess, hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is not chump change. And certainly nobody here suggests that, I think our average donation is something like $75 to $100. You're absolutely right. None of those dollars buy my vote. What they're buying into is the Constitution and we the people, not any of these interests that these other huge organizations have. I would encourage everybody here to go to Numbers USA. There's a poll, or there's a survey system there. You can go and look at my survey. I'm unambiguously anti-amnesty, and I would suggest that if my colleagues here on the stage are interested in telling us exactly where they stand, they submit their surveys at Numbers USA. And one last comment, Chris, because I think this is important. This is not some sort of distant issue for me. My wife is a first natural-born American in her family. Her mom is from Austria, her dad was from England. My son-in-law is a Mexican national. He wants to come to this country legally. And there's nobody that's frustrated more than him to see these varying forms of amnesty which reward rule-breaking with benefit. He wants to do it the right way. Let's get behind good people like that want to come to this country and defeat amnesty.
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Okay. In the interest of time, again, we move now to the candidate-to-candidate questions, and everyone's agreed here, or at least been presented with the format that there'll be two. You can fire, well, it's an inappropriate term. I was going to say fire all shots at one party. You're going to ask all, both of one, or spread the love around. So it's up to you. And Joe, random selection. Mr. Miller didn't realize you'd be ending that last course with your rebuttal, but we'll start with you. The first candidate-to-candidate question. You'll have a minute to pose it, and to whom it is offered, they'll have a minute to reply.
I'm happy to go first. Just make sure at the close I get to go last, Chris. How's that sound? Let's talk about law of the sea tree. I kind of promised that we might go that direction. This is for you, Mr. Treadwell. Let me just start, though, by making a comment about Mr. Sullivan. October 15, 2007, Dan, you said that, quote, updating our Arctic policy will involve U.S. accession to the Law of the Sea Convention. And you also complimented a mutual friend that both you and Mr. Treadwell have, Senator Murkowski, saying that she has shown great leadership on this issue in Washington, and the administration will continue to work with her and others to move the Law of the Sea toward ratification. Now, Mr. Treadwell, on September 24, 2007, you signed a letter that was sent to Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. It was entitled, "The Senate should approve the U.S. accession to the Law of the Sea Treaty," and you said, quote, "We strongly urge the Senate to approve the convention before the adjournment of this session of Congress." Now, 5 days ago, we talked about this before the APRN interviewed you on that subject, and you said that you're now troubled by it. It's similar to what you said in a debate earlier, and that you're changed around, I think, the time of the 2010 election. I have a hard time believing that you changed your views on that after decades of advocacy. In fact, I think that your college thesis was written on it. And in fact, you and I had a personal conversation after 2010 where you were still supporting the Law of the Sea Treaty. I want you to tell everyone here how you believe that a United Nations tax and a regulation on Americans is in the best interest of Americans and Alaskans.
Mr. Treadwell, 1 minute, please.
Your question is, do I believe in a United Nations tax and regulation on Americans? And the answer is no. Solid no. But let me just say this. Here in this town home, okay, when I first came to Alaska in 1974, you could look very closely offshore, off Alaska's coastline, and there were literally hundreds of foreign ships. Alaskans got together and said, we can't get to the 200-mile limit unless we have a negotiation on Law of the Sea. We had that negotiation on Law of the Sea. It has meant the beginning of a huge industry that employs thousands and thousands of Alaskans. Had we not had that Law of the Sea discussion, that wouldn't have happened, number one. Number two, we have a situation right now where the Law of the Sea says that in the Arctic, and only in the Arctic, a ship going by which has oil can actually be regulated by the country it goes by. The State Department doesn't like it very much, but that's what it was agreed to. Okay? Alaska needs that. We have a problem where the Obama administration is stuck on stupid. We have a situation where 2 new Californias could come forward. And I've sat down with proponents and opponents of the Law of the Sea and not demagogue the issue, Joe, sat down to figure out how do we make this issue work. And I am absolutely convinced this treaty will not pass and should not pass as long as that International Seabed Authority is going to tax American citizens. And we're winning on that. But the point is that we should not ignore the benefits that Alaska is getting out of this process. And one of them is put tens of thousands of Alaskans to work. One of them is going to protect our coastline. One of them is going to give us lands twice the size of California. And one of them is going to guarantee freedom of navigation when the Russians and the Canadians are saying that northeast and northwest passage is theirs.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell.
Yes, that's what he gets. He asked the question, I answered, he gets a rebuttal.
Let's do, can we keep it maybe 30 seconds?
Sure, I'll try to keep it as close as I can. The problem is that your whole life's work, even from the time that you did your thesis, was behind the Law of the Sea Treaty. And now you are demagoguing this issue.
Oh, come on.
We're talking about me, come on. We're talking about 150 countries plus that have signed it. We're talking about dozens that have ratified it. There is no way that you're going to have a fundamental part of the Law of the Sea Treaty, such as the International Seabed Authority and its taxation implementation and its technology transfer, changed in any way. You know that can't happen. You'd have to have the cooperation of
well, then we shouldn't ratify it. But the point is that we should still try to get the objectives that Alaskans need.
And my question to you is, when did you change your position? Because as recently as 2010, and then after 2010, you told me that you supported it.
I didn't mark the date on my calendar.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Nice exchange. We'll move on to our next two-candidate question, and we'll go to you, Mr. Sullivan, quietly in the corner. And you've got 1 minute to...
And I think probably happily in the corner on this issue.
So you have 1 minute, sir, if you to ask your question, and they'll have a minute to reply.
So this is for Meade. So Meade, even though the Lieutenant Governor oversees the Division of Elections, you were excused from testifying in an important lawsuit regarding voting rights violation because everybody agreed it would be, quote, a waste of time. This was partially because you didn't know much about the day-to-day operations at Division of Elections, but also seemed because the attorneys thought you were busy running for the U.S. Senate. When I entered the race, before I entered this Senate race, I stepped down from my position as the Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources, because I didn't think you could give 100% of time to that job, very important, or this job, also very important. I wanted this race to have my undivided attention. Under what circumstances, if any, do you think a public servant who is running for higher office should stop taking a taxpayer-funded salary?
Mr. Treadwell, 1 minute for reply.
So first and foremost, Dan, I did testify in that case. I just didn't testify in the trial. I gave an entire afternoon with lots and lots of preparation to attorneys on both sides on that in a lengthy deposition. The questions they asked were answered. Had I been sitting there cooling my heels for 5 days, waiting to be called by a witness on either side, it wasn't necessary, and both sides agreed to that. Now, the motion to the judge, I would have worded differently, but the fact is I have very strong interest in Alaska Native languages. I've worked with our legislature to create an Alaska Native Language Commission. We have worked to make sure that we are following the law. I believe this is a lawsuit where if the law is changing, we will comply with the law. It was over a very minor point of law in terms of which populations it should cover and how the surveys would work. And I was not involved in doing the surveys. I was involved in making sure that we had the resources to do the surveys, and I will work on that. In terms of your question,
yeah.
Okay, I was elected by Alaskans. I was elected by Alaskans without promising not to ever run for another office or to run for the same office as Lieutenant Governor. You were an appointed position. The Constitution founders clearly contemplate and understand that you can serve 1 or 2 terms in one position. You can go for another position. I have gotten my job done, and the state seal is doing just fine, thank you. We continue to work every day. I worked much of the day in the office today before flying down here, and I will tell you that it was appropriate for you to resign as an appointed official running against one of the guys that helped bring you in, and it was appropriate for me as Lieutenant Governor to run and to continue to work to advance the work of the state, and I've done it.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. Okay, we move on to, I guess, tonight's meet in the middle. Sir, you're up next with your candidate question. You've got 1 minute to formulate it, and they'll have a minute to reply.
1 minute to formulate a question. Dan, this is not a gotcha question. This is just a simple question about a group of people who do a lot of things in Alaska, and those are the people that fly for us. We're an aviation state. We're an aerospace state. We play a role in aerospace development and international aviation with rocket launches from Kodiak, Poker Flats, and at least once Shemya. We play a role in missile defense, and we play a role in advancing aviation safety. I've lost 25 friends in my 40 years in Alaska, including Senator Ted Stevens. Now, as a senator, what would you do to develop and support Alaska's aerospace industry, and what would you do to improve aviation safety?
Well, me, on the issue of aviation, in a previous position, and I talked about as an Assistant Secretary of State, one of my responsibilities was negotiating what we called open skies agreements, were agreements to help commercial companies, American companies, access global markets. And I did that. We led those negotiations, and they benefit a very important part of our economy here in Alaska, our commercial aircraft, commercial cargo operations. And so from my perspective, I already have a record of working with the aviation industry to better opportunities in Alaska and throughout the country. I agree with you that with regard to aviation in the state, that we're a very unique place. We have more pilots per capita, and as a U.S. Senator, I would be very focused on safety regulations that focus on keeping our pilots, our passengers safe. But I think this is very important. I also think that we can't over-regulate this part of our economy either. And that's one thing. There's always a tendency to want to do more in terms of regulations, and I think that that ultimately hurts. What I did with regard to the open skies agreements was cut regulations to free up the market to allow Alaskans and Americans to benefit from our very strong comparative advantage as companies that are strong in terms of global aviation, cargo, and that's something I'm proud of in terms of work that I did.
All right, thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Well, Dan, thank you for that. And I guess I'm just going to say with regard to Alaska, I hope this is the last I hear of talk, not action, conferences not producing anything. In my time as Lieutenant Governor, I've been head of the National Organization Aerospace States Association, which helped bring the unmanned vehicles test bed to Alaska. I've worked to support our Kodiak launch site, which has been very important for developing missile defense. I helped get that site financed. As I said before, I went to the industry and I said, unless we protect privacy, you won't have an industry. And I've worked to make privacy happen. I've helped market our airports, bring Iceland Air here to bring more European tourists to Alaska, some of whom are staying probably in this hotel tonight. I've worked to push back when Homeland Security kept China Air from landing here without paying double fees other places. I've worked to help bring ADS-B, our next generation of air traffic control, not only to Alaska but to the whole country in my national position. I've stood up to Darrell Issa on bypass mail. And I will just tell you that the NASA state agreement that I helped forge as a citizen and have seen through in this administration is going to do a whole lot to help bring forward new modes of transportation to get access to our resources. So I guess my point is this: if you're going to represent Alaska, it helps to know Alaska, and it helps to know one of the largest segments of our economy. 47,000 Alaskans work in the aerospace industry.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. And actually, you've got the next question, Mr. Sullivan, your candidate-to-candidate question.
Well, can I just quickly
15
respond?
seconds, if you would. 20, 30. Can I have 30? Anybody 35? Would you 30 seconds. We'll give you 30 seconds. Go
Look,
ahead.
Meade, with regard to
turning.
talk versus action on the critical issues that have been facing this state and administration, energy, TAPS throughput decline, gas line, Cook Inlet renaissance, choose respect. I've been asked to work closely with Governor Parnell on all of those critical issues, and it has been not just talk, not just conferences, going to see the Russians, but action and getting things done that are benefiting middle-class Alaskans. So yes, I do think it's about talk versus action, and that's one of the things I'm running on is a strong record of actually getting things done, real results, not just talking about them, not just going to conferences and listing numerous conferences.
Chris, I'm the elected official here. I was for fixing taxes before the Attorney General was, before the Governor was. I made my whole campaign for Lieutenant Governor on filling the pipeline.
And what role did you play in that?
I've got an entire Dan Sullivan drawer on my desk right now of things that we've gone back and forth in getting to that strategy. And I guess the point is this, is that when an appointed official forgets the fact that elections matter, forgets the fact that we turned the direction in Alaska when we got elected in 2010, and we've worked to keep our promises, I would just expect a little bit more respect for what we've done. Now, you know, I'm not the Attorney General. Your guy Art Hackney made a bunch of ads last time saying, oh, well, you can't just sue the federal government, the AG does that. I understand that, but what do you think, who do you think your client was? Your client's the governor. We put a governor in to get the right things done, and I'm proud of what you've done in many cases. But Dan, it's not credit to you, it's credit to the people elected.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, and we will turn to Mr. Sullivan for your next candidate question, if you would.
So this is for Joe. Joe, you know, about 3 years ago, I think most people recognized or thought the conventional wisdom was that Cook Inlet was a dead basin. We were thinking about importing gas from Canada. Jobs were scarce. Chevron left, or was leaving. Marathon was leaving. And now you fast forward what's happening with regard to the opportunities in Cook Inlet. 17 rigs out here, I think, this summer. Huge, huge opportunities in terms of increased jobs, increased investment, increased oil and gas production. We're not talking about importing gas anywhere. We're talking about exporting gas, restarting the Agrium plant possibly. This is a renaissance. You've talked about it many times, and I just had a question in terms of what you thought were the things that turned the basin around that 3 years ago was considered dead, and now I think is certainly a great example of what we can do in Alaska, but also what we can do nationally.
You know,
Mr. Miller?
Dan, thank you very much. I appreciate that question because I think the Cook Inlet reflects what the state needs to do in a broader fashion. And it's not just a federal issue. A lot of this is at the state level, is opening up opportunity for the independents. There's a lot of marginal hydrocarbon production in the state. There's a lot of major hydrocarbon production as well, where we have to have significant capital investments. The big three up on the slope is a good example of that. But there are many places in declining fields and places where you don't necessarily have that volume of production, where we have to incentivize those, the little guys and gals that are out there trying to produce like what we're seeing in the Dakotas. And I've talked to some of those independents. And you know, some of them actually credit ACES for that investment and that production in the Cook Inlet. Others say, that, and most of the ones I've talked to, by the way, support no on one, but they also say that that helps continue incentivization, but not to the extent that they saw in ACES. My perspective is that anything we do to help out those that are really in the mix to produce as much as they can when they're seeing the bottom dollar themselves are the folk that we need to attract into the state so that we can do what's been done in the Midwest. I mean, North Dakota is a perfect example of what we can do, but we got to remove those barriers. You know, instead of millions of dollars to produce for the independents to get a permit, maybe we need to lower it to what you see in the Midwest with hundreds of dollars.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Okay, our next candidate question calls to you, Mr. Treadwell, and you've got a moment.
Thanks, Chris. You know, Joe, I was going to ask you about fisheries because the United Fishermen of Alaska recently endorsed Mark Begich. And my question for you is, what do you believe we Republicans should do to win the fisheries vote in November, as we have in previous elections? And tell us what in your record is going to do that.
Well, I touched on a little bit of that earlier, Meade. One of the blessings I have of being in the state is we have a wonderful university system. And I was able, this was several years ago, to take advantage of the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I got my master's degree in natural resource economics, which studied the commons. And one of the most important things that we have to do for the fisheries is make sure that we recognize that science is important and recognize also that the federal government does in fact have a role there. It's by treaty and by otherwise, when we're dealing with something that we all partake in benefit of, we need to make sure that we don't minimize that. This is one of the problems with the whole debt scenario, is that when we go out there and we spend money on things that aren't enumerated powers or aren't treaty powers, and we go and we get to a point where we can't actually expend the necessary money to make sure that we protect the fisheries, then the end result of that is going to be adverse for the rest of the state. One of the other things, I've had an opportunity for the Board of Marine Pilots, doesn't have much to do with fisheries, but it does have to do with waters. And it does connect with people that are involved in fisheries. I will tell you that what I've heard from the people I've interacted with, including conversations that I've had on Kodiak, conversations that I've had here on the Kenai, conversations that I've had with others, is the primary thing is not just protecting the commons, but making sure that they are heard and not excluded because other industries, the trawlers, et cetera, have a dominant voice. They want to make sure that their concerns are recognized and protected.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Joe, my fast rebuttal is I'm not sure that's going to get us much votes in Dillingham, but good luck. There are 50,000 fisheries jobs in Alaska. It's our largest locally owned industry. The Magnuson-Stevens Act helped build that industry, and Joe, my thesis that you haven't read, I'd be welcome to have you read it, basically talked about how the Japanese came in with motorized vessels to steal our fish when we were using only sailboats in Bristol Bay, and how we went away from the 200-mile limit for 40 years and almost had a fishery as badly off as New England. The threat to us today in the renewal of the Magnuson-Stevens Act is we could have a situation that could put us in as bad a situation as New England. New England is asking for a way to let out the string so that you don't have to rebuild your fisheries as close. And I'm really worried about that as that goes before Mark Begich's committee. There are people trying to divert our resources into an ocean policy, ocean zoning situation that Ted Stevens warned if you do it, you'll never get another fish from the sea. You have people who tried once to move away regionalization and regional power. And on science issues, I have a record of getting the Prince William Sound Science Center started, of helping get the North Pacific Research Board started, of getting the Alaska Sea Life Center started, of getting the Arctic programs started by NOAA. And this has not been earmark, gross work coming home. It's been making sure that we had the science to fight the Endangered Species Act issues, to manage our fish properly, and to understand the ecosystem so that 50,000 Alaskans could keep their jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Treadwell. As the
That's action, not talk.
We have
I'm all about action.
Yes. All three of you tonight will have a closing segment. We've come to the final in our lightning round.
Do I get a second question?
That's the
I gotta ask Dan a
final.
question.
No, that's the
I don't wanna just
final
be
in our
a-
lightning round here, and then we'll move into the closing statements. I was just preparing the audience for a few more minutes. Of entertainment.
Sorry about that, folks. I'm going to, I guess, call this, Dan, kind of a sewer rebuttal. I reach over and put my arm around you, but you're too far away while I ask you. So that you understand that this is love. We've heard a little bit about the surveillance state. And you created, at least I seem to hear, some distance between you and basically the author of the surveillance state, the Bush administration. You worked for them, it was their policy. We kind of heard about that on climate change too, where you were kind of, maybe not necessarily the point guy, but you certainly were applying the agenda, the assumption of anthropogenic man-made global warming while under the Bush administration. But you were being a good foot soldier, you were doing what your administration told you to do. The question I have, this goes back to the standard rail that we talked about back in Anchorage, is this. I noticed that the ad that you were replaying over and over again, that you fought to pass stand your ground, that's been pulled. I mean, at least I have not heard it. And I'm wondering if, when you say that you fight for something, I want to turn you back to 2010. We know that there were no less than, I think, 3 assistant attorney generals that actually testified against stand your ground. But you also had a letter that issued that basically put out your concern with taking away the duty to retreat. You didn't sign it, granted, but it was under your name, an assistant attorney general signed for you. My question for you is this, that if you in fact were in charge of that department, are you responsible?
Yes. So let me answer the question more broadly. At our last debate, you insisted, citing the Anchorage Daily News as a source, which I thought was a little ironic, Joe, coming from you.
And I pointed that out.
You did, and I wrote that. Well, we now know that that wasn't the case. I did have a guy who, one of my assistant AGs, wrote a letter raising a lot of concerns with the author of that, Mark Newman, and the staff at the Attorney General's office worked to get legislation through that we all supported. I was supporting Stand Your Ground then, I support Stand Your Ground now. The broader issue from my perspective is the Second Amendment. And I've had the honor, as your Attorney General, of working on issues that are critical with regard to the Second Amendment. One of the ones that I think is critical to all of us was the Chicago versus McDonald case. That was the first time in U.S. history that the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment applies to individual Americans. One of the most important Supreme Court cases in the country's history. I worked with a bunch of attorneys generals, led Alaska's efforts on that, to ask the Supreme Court to take the case, to brief with a bunch of AGs for them to rule in that regard, and it was a 5-4 decision. 2 of the justices that Mark Begich voted for, Elena Kagan and Justice Sotomayor, were in the dissent. And now they're already talking about rolling that back. That's why Mark Begich needs to go. And I have a strong record on the Second Amendment that I'm proud of, and proud to have served as your Attorney General, promoting our Second Amendment rights.
Mr. Miller.
Just briefly, Dan, the concern I have is that you characterize yourself in this race as a fighter. And yet, over the course of time, from 2010 when you opposed, or at least your department that you take responsibility for, opposed it, not just a little bit, 3 assistant AGs, a letter, you were very much involved against it. But from 2010 to 2012, when I believe it actually passed, as far as I know, not one email, not one document, not anything other than, say, Representative Newman's letter that does not even cite you personally. There is nothing that reflects that fight.
So we got that through with working with Representative Newman, and as I mentioned, I'm a very, very strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I'm glad we have Stand Your Ground legislation right now in Alaska.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Treadwell, we'll start with you. 3 minutes.
Thanks. This will be a good debate. And to the audience who sat here for now 2.5 hours, or a little bit more, thank you for your time. And we must bring decision-making home to Alaska. And that's what motivates me to run. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, she's coming back, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Mark Begich. Mark Begich enables these people. He's on their team. A travesty of justice helped put him there. And his only legislative accomplishment, according to the Washington Post, is naming a courthouse. But he's helped throw new trillion-dollar logs on the fire, including Obamacare and the stimulus. America cannot afford Mark Begich, and neither can Alaska. But ladies and gentlemen, Mark Begich could win this election. Why? First, he successfully tagged one of my opponents as someone from outside, a carpetbagger, someone who moved here for ambition, tax reasons, and someone who can't remember one fishing license to the next, one tax form to the next, one biography to the next, where he's from and when he came. And I'm glad Dan's here, but I believe his lack of experience with our fisheries, our coastal communities, our science, our Arctic, heck, even your record on that most important permitting bill, HB 77, Dan, alone has Republicans and Democrats and independents concerned about tone deafness to Alaskans. Another man in this race speaks great words about liberty and limited government, but he's handcuffed to his past. And I just have to say, half-truths and anger isn't going to cut it with the electorate. And Joe, there you go again with that bingo card. You've handed out a brochure in 2 parades filled with half-truths about me, and you know it. So send any one of these guys, and there's a greater chance we lose the election in November, and that would be a shame for the Alaska Vision. And I really believe the Alaska Vision is what we have to turn back to in Washington, D.C. It's a great place to live. We want to keep it that way, and to do so, we need bold action. Not letters and lawsuits, but real bold legislation to bring power home, to bring our land home, to bring decision-making home. Big outside money doesn't want that. They want the status quo. They've arrogantly decided already who should win this race. And this is the same money that is working to slam Common Core down our throats. It's the same big money on Wall Street that demanded bailouts. Send them a message. We didn't get their memo. Let Alaska produce, and our nation will be stronger. I sincerely ask for your vote, for your time, your talent, your treasure, your touch, and your prayers. Send an Alaskan who knows us, one who will work for us, not against us. Vote for Main Street, not Wall Street, to create wealth, not to stifle it, and vote for families and respect our freedoms. Thank you very much.
Mr. Sullivan, you've got three minutes.
Okay, thanks everybody. It was a great evening at 2.5 hours. I feel like this is the Lincoln Douglas debates or something here. But I want to thank Joe and Meade also, of course. Putting your hat in the ring, it's a big deal. And I just want to thank you because hopefully you're seeing it. I'm loving what I'm doing in terms of campaigning. I think it's a huge privilege to do this because we get to come into people's homes, businesses, communities, hear what the challenges are, hear what the opportunities are, listen, and try to make a difference. And to me, that's a giant privilege, so thank you. I want to mention one thing. In all these meetings, something that's starting to come up a little bit, not too much, but some concerns from our fellow Alaskans about the direction of the country, not only, and I've talked about it, this Obama, Harry Reid, Begich agenda going fundamentally in the wrong direction, but people actually losing hope in America and where we're going. And to me, hopelessness is not an American ideal. We need to turn this around. I believe we can turn this around, or I would not be standing here. I would not be standing here if I didn't think we could turn this around with regard to our country, and that is why this election is so important. And I think Alaska is a great example, and I talked about it, but look at what's happening in certain parts of our state. Cook Inlet, we're turning it around. The North Slope, we're turning it around. The gas line, we are starting to see real action. Companies are buying land. Are we there yet? No. But we've made huge progress. And I'm glad to have played a leadership role in that progress. It is about action. It is about action. Whether it's on Point Thompson, 1,200 Alaskans working on that. When I took over as AG, they said, don't bother. But it's been all of us. And I think what I'm focused on doing is making sure we have a doer again in Washington. Mark Begich is definitely not a doer, but also a fighter. And I am proud of my record as a fighter. I am proud of my record of taking this administration on. Whether it's Obamacare, whether it's winning in the Supreme Court with an EPA case, whether it's going after the abuses of the Endangered Species Act. We need someone who's got a record of being in the arena, pushing back on this federal overreach that is stifling every aspect of our lives and economy. Mark Begich isn't doing it, and I'm a candidate who's got a record of doing it through policies of less government and more freedom, and that's the kind of can-do conservatism that I think we need to bring to Washington. So I would be honored by your vote. I would be honored by your support. And I think it's critical that we send leaders who have a record of getting real results, real things done, fighting this administration successfully, not just talking about it, not just going to conferences, and starting the critical rollback of this Obama, Mark Begich, Harry Reid agenda that has sent our country in the wrong direction. I would be honored by your vote, and I want to thank all of you again for just listening to the three of us rant on for 2.5 hours. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you. And thank you, Eileen, and thank you for everybody else that came out tonight to listen to us. And it's a little hotter, I think, up here than maybe down below there. But the fact is, I know that for some of you, it's probably been quite a strain to sit here. I want to thank also all my volunteers. I mean, they are second to none in this state. And I invite you to be part of our volunteer base tonight if you like what you've heard. We are a group that is not representing Joe Miller. We're representing we the people. That's why they are behind us now. And I got to tell you, it's a very committed group. One of the things I want to talk a little bit about, this is the elephant in the room, and that's Lisa Murkowski. And I got to bring this up, even though my opponents don't like hearing about it. And some of you may push back a little bit too. But hear me out on this. This election is a twofer. Who you elect in this cycle will definitely determine whether or not you believe Lisa Murkowski is good for Alaska and should stay for Alaska. I, for one, disagree with the proposition that Mr. Treadwell stated in Politico a few months ago that she's good for Alaska. I also disagree with the proposition of both of my opponents that they are unifiers in the Republican Party. They both supported someone other than the nominee in 2010 and continue to support an incumbent senator who is not good for Alaska. Right. Let's talk a little bit about that. Lame duck agenda, the only Republican to vote for all 5 pieces of Obama's legislation. The DREAM Act, the New START Treaty, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the tax compromise. She, in fact, opposed the extension of the Bush-era tax cuts, accused Republicans of a war on women, voted for cloture to fund Obamacare, came out for gay marriage, and shilled for the funding of Planned Parenthood. Now, I've confronted both my opponents on this. I don't think that you can say that you're going to D.C. and you're going to stand up to these powers in the establishment and back the type of thing that is taking this country down. I have a demonstrated record of reform and fighting the establishment. Nobody else on this stage has that. I mean, we have both that supported Murkowski. We have one that worked for the Bush administration and says, oh, it was just his boss's business when it comes to climate change and the surveillance state. These are things we need to think about. My friend Meade Treadwell, I mean, he supported it and he admits it. Pro-abortion candidates. And by the way, the reason this sheet is getting passed out, and the reason why I ask you not to trust my word for it, is because you have the sources on the back. And if there's something factually inaccurate in this, bring it to my attention. For example, tonight, we had Mr. Sullivan say that he's against amnesty. So we're going to put that on there. Now we're going to add that we can't find anything on his website explaining what that means, so you can still continue to pressure him for a good word on it. But the point of all of this is this. If you're supporting somebody that Begich now is running ads about, and this is something we really need to pay close attention to, running ads about voting 80% with Lisa Murkowski, he's already made it an issue. And if you're going out and saying Lisa Murkowski is good for the state of Alaska, do you think you're going to be able to beat Begich when he's got incumbency and he's doing what their friend wants? I ask you to support our candidacy. Go to joeforliberty.com, volunteer. I pledge to you that I will fight for you endlessly. That's what I've done in my past, and I'll do it not for me, but for you, your children, and your grandchildren. Thank you. God bless, and God bless.